My name is Briar Sinclair. I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my father, Richard Sinclair, stood at the head of a mahogany boardroom table and announced to 12 corporate executives that I was being removed from the company I spent my entire adult life building. I was the vice president of product development. I had spent 8 years on the factory floor with metal shavings in my boots and motor oil permanently stained into my cuticles. My cousin Preston sat next to my father, wearing a bespoke Italian suit and a smirk he could barely hide. Preston had never touched a lathe or calibrated a micrometer in his life. My father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You were only ever a placeholder, Briar. Sinclair Heavy Industries needs a polished corporate face, not a shop floor manager." 12 pairs of eyes watched as my own blood handed my legacy to an arrogant imposter. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg. What they did not know was that my grandfather had anticipated this exact betrayal decades ago, and I already had the key to their destruction hidden away. Before I tell you what I did next, please take a moment to subscribe to Aura Vengeance. I would love to know your age and where you are listening from, so drop that in the comments below. Now, to understand why I walked out of that room without shedding a single tear, let me take you back to the beginning. The Sinclair family name means one thing in Detroit, Michigan, and that is heavy manufacturing. We build the high-pressure valves and industrial components that keep commercial engines running across the globe. My grandfather started the company with a single manual machine and a fierce blue-collar grit. He believed that true respect is earned in the heat of the factory, not handed down in a corner office. When he passed away, my father Richard took over as chief executive officer. My father is a man who values country club memberships, luxury cars, and superficial appearances over everything else. He hates the smell of the factory floor. He hates the deafening noise of the stamping presses. And most of all, he hated that his only daughter preferred a pair of steel-toed work boots over designer heels. Then there is Preston. Preston is the son of my father's sister. He just finished his business degree at an elite university and genuinely believes he knows how to run a manufacturing empire because he read a textbook on operational efficiency. When Preston joined the company, my father immediately started grooming him for leadership. I was the one working 70-hour weeks developing our new revolutionary high-pressure fuel housing. I was the one earning the deep respect of the men and women who actually built our products. But whenever there was a photo opportunity for a local business magazine, my father would pull Preston in front of the camera and push me into the background. The day my father fired me started like any other Tuesday. I was down on the floor running thermal diagnostics on a new prototype. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal. My father's assistant called down and told me my presence was required in the executive suite. I walked into the boardroom wearing my canvas work jacket. The contrast between my grease-stained hands and the 12 board members in their tailored suits was stark. My father did not even offer me a seat. He simply read from a prepared legal statement. He told the board that the company was pivoting toward a new corporate strategy and that my hands-on operational role was being eliminated. I looked at Preston. He was adjusting his expensive watch, pretending to look sympathetic, but his eyes were shining with unearned triumph. I asked my father who would be taking over the product development division. He did not blink when he said, "Preston is the new executive vice president." The silence in the room was suffocating. These board members knew my technical expertise was the only reason our latest contracts were fulfilled on time. Yet they all nodded in quiet obedience to my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. I simply turned on my heel and walked out, leaving them to their delusions. I went straight to my office and packed my things methodically. I wrapped my original blueprints in a worn canvas dropcloth. At the bottom of my desk drawer rested my most prized possession, a pair of heavy, tarnished brass calipers my late grandfather gave me when I was 12 years old. My father had called them relics earlier that week, mocking my reliance on manual measurements instead of digital scanners. I dropped the calipers into my box and walked toward the elevator. The glass walls of my office overlooked the sprawling manufacturing floor below. It was a beautiful symphony of sparking metal and grinding gears. But as I looked down, my blood ran cold. Preston was already on the floor. He was wearing a pristine, unscratched hard hat that looked absurd on his perfectly styled hair. He was standing directly in front of Big Joe, our senior legacy foreman. Big Joe had been loyal to this company since before Preston was born. Preston was pointing a manicured finger in the older man's face, berating him over a suboptimal workflow and threatening to write him up for insubordination. The disrespect was palpable. The surrounding workers had stopped their machines. The tension was thick enough to cut with a bandsaw. I set my box down on the glass desk and took the stairs down to the floor, 2 steps at a time. The factory noise seemed to dull as I approached them. I used my last shred of authority as a minority shareholder to step between them. I looked Preston up and down and told him to back away from my foreman. Preston scoffed, telling me I had no right to give orders anymore. He puffed out his chest, trying to assert dominance in a room full of people who despised him. I looked at his soft, uncalloused hands and told him he had no idea what it takes to run this floor. I turned to Joe and authorized an immediate early lunch break for the entire shift. The men dropped their tools and walked away without looking at Preston once. Preston glared at me, his face flushed with embarrassment. He promised me he would have security escort me off the premises if I ever set foot on the concrete again. I walked out into the freezing Detroit air, knowing I was not just losing my livelihood. I was leaving my grandfather's soul in the hands of corporate scavengers who would sell it for parts. I needed a way to fight back, but I could not do it alone. That evening, I drove to a dimly lit dive bar on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place where the tables are sticky and the neon signs flicker. Valerie was already waiting for me in a back booth. Valerie is a fiercely intelligent corporate auditor and my closest friend. She is the sharpest mind in the industrial logistics sector, and she knows exactly how to track dirty money. She slid a thick manila folder across the table before I even sat down. Valerie had been quietly digging into the public vendor filings for Sinclair Heavy Industries. She looked at me with a grim expression and said, "Preston is sloppy Breyer. He is moving too fast." She opened the folder to reveal a stack of highlighted invoices. Within 48 hours of securing his new title, Preston had already switched our primary raw material supplier. He bypassed our trusted Detroit vendors and signed an exclusive contract with an unknown shell company, charging triple the market rate for subpar metals. He was taking kickbacks. But worse than the financial theft was the engineering reality of his decision. I reviewed the invoices and my stomach dropped. Preston was swapping the aerospace-grade titanium in my upcoming high-pressure valve design for a standard cheap aluminum alloy. He was doing it to artificially boost his quarterly margins and make himself look like a financial genius to the board. He did not understand the physics of the product. He did not understand that aluminum would lose all structural integrity under the extreme atmospheric strain of commercial engines. Exposing his kickbacks wouldn't be enough. My father would just bury the audit to protect the family reputation. Valerie and I sat in that dark booth and formed a plan. We needed undeniable proof, and we needed to wait for Preston's own arrogance to engineer his downfall. The trap was set. All we had to do was watch him walk blindly right into it. To make sure my cousin and my father lowered their defenses, I needed them to believe I was defeated. I needed them to think I was walking away from the fight without a backwards glance. I packed a small overnight bag and booked a flight out of state. I arranged a highly visible lunch meeting with the lead recruiter for our biggest competitor in Chicago. I deliberately left my printed itinerary resting on the kitchen island at my father's house when I went over to drop off my spare keys. I knew his executive assistant would find it and report back immediately. The bait worked flawlessly. Believing I had surrendered and was fleeing Michigan, Preston dropped all remaining caution. He thought he had won the war and secured his place at the top of the food chain. Through a trusted contact still working in the drafting department, I learned exactly what Preston did next. He accessed the secure servers using administrative privileges. He bypassed the read-only protections and downloaded the raw drafting files for the high-pressure fuel housing I had spent 2 years designing. He was preparing to present my prototype to the visiting delegation of automotive executives as his own brilliant innovation. He wanted to secure a lucrative supply contract and cement his status as the corporate savior. But he was manufacturing my design, using the cheap standard aluminum from his shell company. He was trading structural integrity for a short-term financial bonus. Detroit was built on the backs of people who knew how to turn raw steel into breathing machines. My grandfather started Sinclair Heavy Industries with a single manual lathe and a vision. He taught me that a company is only as strong as the materials it uses and the hands that shape them. When I was a little girl, he would walk me down the assembly lines. He knew the name of every machinist, every welder, and every floor manager. He treated them like family because they were the ones keeping the lights on. My father inherited the wealth, but none of the wisdom. He views the factory workers as replaceable numbers on a spreadsheet. He replaced the calluses of hard work with the soft comfort of executive bonuses. I could not let innocent technicians get hurt on the testing floor. I waited in the underground parking garage of the corporate tower the next morning. The air smelled of damp concrete and expensive car exhaust. I intercepted an older board member named Silas as he unlocked his luxury sedan. Silas had worked closely with my grandfather and respected the rigorous testing process. I stood in front of his vehicle and laid out the thermodynamic equations. I explained exactly what happens to standard aluminum when subjected to 10,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. It does not just warp. It shatters like glass under that kind of atmospheric strain. I begged him to cancel the demonstration. Silas looked at me with genuine pity, but he shook his head. He told me Richard had made his decision and that crossing the chief executive would mean corporate suicide. The men in charge were so blinded by their own greed, they were marching straight into a disaster. The dramatic irony was suffocating. I knew the exact second the machine would fail, but I was locked out of the system. I was forced into the role of a helpless spectator. My warning was ignored, setting the stage for the catastrophe I witnessed from the fence line. That brings us back to the immediate aftermath of the explosion. The Ford executives had crawled off the floor covered in dust and walked out of the facility without saying a single word. They took a pending $90 million contract with them. Preston stood in the ruins of the test engine, trembling. I knew the fallout would be swift, but I underestimated just how ruthless my own family could be. 2 hours after the blast, my phone rang. It was the corporate legal department ordering me to the executive suite. I walked into the same mahogany boardroom where I had been fired. My father was pacing the floor. Preston was sitting at the table nursing a glass of scotch, looking like a cornered animal. 3 unfamiliar corporate lawyers sat with their briefcases open. My father did not ask for my assessment of the failure. He slammed a thick stack of printed server logs onto the table. He accused me of altering the drafting files before I left the company. He claimed I sabotaged Preston's test out of bitter jealousy. I stared at him in disbelief. I explained the metallurgy. I told him Preston swapped the titanium for cheap aluminum to pocket the cost difference. But Preston had planned ahead. He had bribed the third-party testing firm to falsify the material logs. He pointed his manicured finger at me and told the lawyers I was trying to destroy the Sinclair legacy. My father looked at me with cold calculation. He did not care about the truth. He cared about protecting the Golden Boy and maintaining the illusion of total control. My father has always prioritized optics over product safety. He would rather watch his own company burn from the inside than admit he made a mistake in front of his country club peers. Seeing Preston sitting in that boardroom, trying to hide his incompetence behind a tailored suit, made my stomach turn. Preston had never spent a single late night troubleshooting a hydraulic leak. He had never burned his hands on fresh welds. Yet here he was, ready to send me to jail for a failure he orchestrated. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade on the factory floor. I realized in that moment that my father did not just want me out of the company. He wanted to erase my contributions entirely. He wanted to rewrite history so that Preston looked like the solitary genius who propelled Sinclair into the future. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He slid a legal document across the polished wood. It was a formal confession of corporate sabotage and a binding non-disclosure agreement. He delivered the ultimatum. He told me to sign the confession and voluntarily forfeit my minority board shares. If I complied, he promised not to press criminal charges. He was willing to send his own daughter to federal prison to protect his nephew's fabricated image. I looked at the pen resting on top of the document. I looked at the smug relief washing over Preston's face. They thought they had backed me into a corner I could not escape. I did not raise my voice. I pulled out my phone and took a clear photograph of the documents on the table. I turned around and walked toward the heavy double doors. My father yelled after me that I had exactly 24 hours to sign or he would call the authorities. I walked out of the corporate tower feeling the weight of the ticking clock. I was entirely locked out of the system with no allies on the inside. I needed a miracle to flip the board before I lost everything my grandfather built. As I walked across the marble lobby of the corporate tower, the reality of my situation set in. I had 24 hours before my father handed those falsified logs to the police. I had no access to the servers to prove Preston altered the documents. I had no access to the shell company accounts to prove the kickbacks. Valerie and I had a theory, but we needed hard, physical evidence. The odds were stacked impossibly high against me. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the freezing evening air. The streetlights of the industrial district were just flickering on, casting long shadows across the pavement. I zipped up my canvas jacket and prepared to lose the only life I had ever known. But the universe has a funny way of leveling the playing field just when you think the game is over. A long black town car glided to a stop beside the curb, right in front of me. The heavy tinted window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. The man sitting in the leather interior of the luxury sedan was Thomas Holden. He had served as the primary legal counsel for Sinclair Heavy Industries back when the enterprise actually produced quality machinery instead of polished press releases. Thomas possessed a face weathered by decades of brutal corporate litigation. He loathed my father with a quiet, simmering intensity. He viewed Preston as a parasitic infection, draining the lifeblood of a proud institution. Holden gestured for me to enter the vehicle. I slid into the back seat. The heavy door shut with a solid, reassuring thud, isolating us from the freezing urban wind and the bleak reality of the industrial district. As the driver steered the car through the desolate manufacturing corridors, Holden reached into his tailored overcoat. He retrieved an antique brass key and placed it in my palm. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. Its jagged teeth were cut in a complex pattern rarely seen in modern security systems. Holden spoke in a low, gravelly tone that commanded instant respect. He explained that my grandfather never trusted Richard to protect the legacy. The patriarch understood that vanity and greed would eventually corrupt the executive board. Therefore, he engineered a hidden failsafe into the foundational architecture of the business. Holden detailed how the current corporate bylaws drafted during my father's tenure were legally subordinate to a pristine, unalterable document from 1982. My grandfather had placed a singular, irrevocable voting unit into a blind trust. This unit was known among the old guard as the Golden Share. It held supreme veto power over any executive decision, including the termination of minority shareholders or the sale of corporate assets. The activation protocol for this hidden authority rested inside a leather-bound ledger. That specific book was locked inside a subterranean safety deposit box downtown. Only my biometric signature and the brass key could open the vault. Holden warned me that the clock was working against us. If my father formally executed the forfeiture documents tomorrow morning, the blind trust would dissolve into the ether. The failsafe would die forever, leaving the company in the hands of scavengers. I gripped the brass key tight enough to leave indentations in my palm. I told the driver to pull over. I needed to contact Valerie immediately. The battle lines were drawn, and I had less than 12 hours to secure the ultimate weapon. Dawn broke over the Detroit skyline, painting the low-hanging clouds in shades of bruised purple and industrial gray. I stood outside the imposing granite facade of the First National Depository. Valerie waited on the stone steps holding a sleek silver briefcase containing her encrypted forensic hardware. We did not exchange pleasantries. The stakes were too high for casual conversation. We bypassed the armed security guards and descended into the subterranean vault level. The air down there tasted metallic and ancient, smelling faintly of dust and old paper. The vault attendant guided us to a reinforced steel wall lined with hundreds of small, numbered doors. I slid the brass key into the mechanical lock while pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner panel. A green light flashed. The heavy steel drawer hissed open on oiled tracks. Inside lay the 1982 incorporation ledger. It was a dense, beautiful piece of history, bound in dark leather with the Sinclair crest embossed on the cover. The pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwritten notes outlining the true purpose of the enterprise. While I carefully turned the fragile pages, searching for the legal mechanism, Valerie booted up her diagnostic tablet. She had managed to mirror the network address of Preston's secure laptop during our shadow investigation. Valerie initiated a deep dive into the routing numbers connected to the fraudulent aluminum supplier. The glowing screen illuminated her intense, focused expression. Her fingers flew across the digital keyboard, bypassing the superficial firewalls Preston paid to install. She traced the inflated raw material invoices through a labyrinth of offshore holding accounts. I continued scanning the ledger, searching for the hidden protocol Holden mentioned. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the soft hum of the ventilation system and the rapid tapping of Valerie's fingertips. Then Valerie gasped. The sound echoed sharply in the silent concrete room. She spun the tablet around to face me, pushing it across the stainless steel examination table. She had not just uncovered Preston's embezzlement trail. She had unearthed a secondary, hidden communication node. My father was copied on the encrypted transaction receipts. Richard knew about the kickbacks. He was intentionally allowing his nephew to bleed the operation's budget dry. Valerie translated the financial jargon into a devastating reality. My father was artificially inflating the profit margins by using cheap materials and turning a blind eye to the theft because he was preparing the company for a hostile acquisition. He was negotiating a clandestine buyout with a foreign industrial conglomerate. Richard planned to sell the entire Detroit legacy, fire the loyal blue-collar workforce, and parachute away with a 9-figure payout. He framed me for the prototype failure because my rigorous safety standards threatened the swift completion of the sale. The betrayal was staggering. My own flesh and blood was orchestrating the systematic destruction of our heritage. He was willing to sacrifice the livelihoods of hundreds of workers just to secure his own early retirement. I looked back down at the ledger, my vision blurring with fresh fury. My fingers stopped on page 42, paragraph 7. The Founder Clause. The ink was faded, but the legal mandate remained pristine and ironclad. My grandfather had anticipated a scenario where a soft-handed executive attempted to hijack the operation. The clause detailed a mandatory physical competency test for anyone attempting to assume majority voting control. It was a brilliant, eccentric, and legally binding hurdle designed specifically to weed out corporate parasites. To activate the golden share, the heir apparent had to step onto the factory floor and prove their worth with raw steel and calibrated machinery. We had the ammunition. We possessed the proof of the foreign buyout, the embezzlement trail, and the legal instrument to halt the hostile takeover. I felt a surge of cold determination replacing the initial shock of my father's treachery. I was ready to walk into the boardroom and tear their carefully constructed illusions to pieces. As I carefully placed the ledger into my canvas bag, my mobile phone vibrated intensely against my ribs. The caller identification displayed the name of our senior floor manager, Big Joe. I answered the call, anticipating a routine update from the shop. Instead, I heard the chaotic roar of shouting voices and clashing metal in the background. Joe spoke with a frantic urgency I had never heard from the hardened veteran. He told me Preston was currently standing on the main assembly floor, flanked by private security contractors. Preston was panicking over the prototype explosion. To cover his tracks before the impending board meeting, he was firing the entire senior quality control team. He planned to blame those loyal workers for the material swap, effectively ruining their careers and pensions to save his own skin. Joe warned me that the union machinists were shutting down the automated presses and threatening a wildcat strike. The situation was escalating into a physical confrontation between the workers and the corporate guards. I hung up the phone and looked at Valerie. The time for operating in the shadows was over. Preston was trying to burn the evidence by destroying the lives of the people who built our family wealth. We packed our equipment in silence. We needed to step directly into the line of fire. I grabbed the brass key and headed for the reinforced door. The real war for Sinclair Heavy Industries was moving from the boardroom down to the factory floor, and I was not going to let a suit-wearing coward win. Mallory and I navigated the morning traffic heading straight toward the industrial sector. The towering smokestacks of the Sinclair Heavy Industries main assembly plant loomed against the gray winter sky. This facility was a cathedral of modern manufacturing, encompassing 200,000 square feet of raw productive power. Normally, the ground outside vibrated with the rhythmic thud of industrial stamping presses. Today, an unnatural stillness blanketed the property. That silence meant the automated lines were halted, costing the enterprise thousands of dollars every passing minute. We bypassed the front administrative lobby and entered through the loading dock doors. The atmosphere inside the cavernous building was electric with suppressed anger. A crowd of 50 union machinists had formed a tight semicircle near the central control booth. In the center of that tense arena stood my cousin Preston. He was flanked by 3 private security contractors wearing tactical vests, which only insulted the hardworking crew further. Preston clutched a stack of pink termination slips. He was pointing a trembling finger at Big Joe, our senior legacy foreman. Joe was a towering figure with silver hair and shoulders like boulders. He started sweeping these very floors at 18 years old, right after returning from a military deployment. Over 4 decades, Joe had mastered every mechanical quirk of our assembly hardware. He commanded the loyalty of every soul on this floor. Preston was trying to fire Joe and the entire senior quality control team, using them as scapegoats for his own prototype failure. I pushed through the heavy steel double doors. My boots struck the concrete floor with purposeful, heavy steps. The sea of blue-collar workers turned and immediately parted, allowing me a clear path to the center of the dispute. The tension in their weary eyes shifted to a glimmer of hope. I looked at Joe and raised my hand, asking him to stand down. Joe gave a curt nod and folded his arms across his chest. Preston sneered at me, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He told me I was trespassing and threatened to have his rented security guards drag me out of the building. His voice cracked, revealing his underlying panic. I stepped closer, bridging the physical distance, until I stood inches from his polished Italian loafers. I kept my voice low and steady, ensuring every worker on the floor could hear the calm authority in my tone. I reminded my arrogant cousin that the board had not yet formalized my expulsion. The official vote was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Until the ink dried on those documents, I retained my status as a minority shareholder and a vested executive. I invoked a formal corporate injunction, freezing all personnel changes and halting any disciplinary actions against the floor staff. Preston laughed, a thin, nervous sound. He claimed my executive rights were suspended and told the guards to remove me. The guards took one step forward but stopped when Big Joe and 50 machinists simultaneously stepped forward to meet them. The numerical disadvantage was stark. Valerie stepped out from behind me, her sharp eyes locking on to Preston. She introduced herself as an independent forensic auditor. She casually mentioned the specific name of the shell company Preston used to purchase the cheap aluminum. She commented on the routing numbers and the offshore holding accounts. She suggested that firing the quality control team would look like a desperate cover-up when the federal authorities started digging into the supply chain discrepancies. All the color drained from Preston's face. He looked at the pink slips in his hand as if they were suddenly on fire. He shoved the papers into his briefcase and barked an order for the security team to retreat. He promised me he would finalize my destruction at the board meeting, but his retreat was swift and uncoordinated. The workers erupted into cheers, but I raised my hand to quiet them. The factory was safe for today, but the war was far from won. We left the facility and spent the afternoon preparing for the next phase of our counteroffensive. The battleground would shift from the gritty factory floor to the most opulent venue in the city. That evening was the annual Detroit Heavy Manufacturers Gala. It is the undisputed social pinnacle of the industrial sector. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars are routinely sealed over champagne and caviar in that ballroom. My father, Richard, would undeniably use this prestigious event to perform damage control. He needed to placate investors and assure the elite automotive buyers that the recent prototype explosion was a minor, temporary setback. He planned to parade Preston around the room, showcasing him as the resilient future of the company. We needed to strike my father in the one place he left unguarded: his public ego. Valerie and I arrived at the Grand Hotel ballroom just as the string quartet began playing. Valerie wore a sharp emerald dress, while I opted for a tailored black suit. I had no interest in blending in with the socialites. The rooms sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the clinking of expensive glassware. We scanned the crowd and quickly located our targets. Richard and Preston were standing near an elaborate ice sculpture, desperately cornering Marcus Thorne. Marcus is the chief executive officer of a dominant Tier 1 automotive supply group. He is a pragmatic, ruthless businessman who started his career as a mechanical engineer. He respects empirical data and functional results over empty corporate promises. I approached their circle with Valerie close behind. My father's eyes widened in sheer panic when he noticed me. He tried to physically block my path, forcing a tight, artificial smile. He attempted to dismiss me, telling Marcus I was just leaving. Marcus, however, recognized me from a previous industry convention. He extended his hand and asked for my professional perspective on the recent testing failure. Preston began to sweat visibly. He stammered, trying to change the subject to global supply chain logistics. I ignored him entirely and focused my attention on Marcus. I engaged the prominent executive in a highly technical, precise discussion. I broke down the thermal dynamics of high-pressure containment vessels. I analyzed the tensile yield strength of various alloys and explained the exact physics of the failure mechanism. I did not mention sabotage or point fingers. I simply demonstrated a flawless mastery of the engineering reality. Marcus listened with intense fascination, nodding along as I articulated the mathematical boundaries of the hardware. He asked complex questions, and I answered them with effortless accuracy. During the entire 10-minute exchange, Preston stood there mute and trembling. He lacked the fundamental vocabulary to contribute a single word to the conversation. The contrast was glaring and undeniable. Marcus realized very quickly who possessed the actual intellect behind Sinclair Heavy Industries. When Marcus finally excused himself to greet another colleague, the facade my father maintained crumbled. Richard grabbed my arm, his face flushed with quiet fury. He accused me of trying to publicly humiliate his designated successor. I pulled my arm free and smoothed the lapel of my suit jacket. I leaned in very close so only my father could hear my words over the ambient noise of the gala. I told him I knew about the foreign buyout. I told him Valerie had traced his encrypted communications regarding the planned hostile takeover. The champagne glass in his hand began to shake, spilling drops of expensive wine onto his polished shoes. Before he could form a cohesive defense, I delivered the final, devastating blow. I mentioned the 1982 incorporation ledger. I told him I possessed the brass key and that I had unlocked the subterranean vault. I promised him the blind trust and the founder clause were fully prepared for deployment. My father looked as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. The breath left his lungs in a ragged, shallow gasp. I did not wait for his response. I turned and walked toward the exit with Valerie, leaving Richard and Preston stranded in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the very peers they sought to impress. The psychological dismantling was complete. I had planted the seed of profound terror in my father's mind and publicly exposed Preston's incompetence without ever raising my voice. The stage was perfectly set for the final confrontation. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. They thought they were gathering to finalize my expulsion and strip my shares. They had no idea they were walking into a legal trap engineered 4 decades ago by a man who saw this exact betrayal coming. To gather the evidence required to dismantle my father's corporate facade, I needed him and Preston to lower their defenses. Paranoia is a powerful motivator, and as long as they viewed me as a looming threat, they would keep their digital footprints hidden. I had to convince them I was a defeated woman walking away from the battlefield. I reached out to a professional contact at a rival manufacturing conglomerate based in Chicago. They had been trying to poach my talent for years. I agreed to a formal interview for a senior design position. I did not just make a phone call. I orchestrated a theatrical retreat. I printed my flight itinerary and left it exposed on the kitchen island when I went to my father's estate to return my spare gate keys. I knew his executive assistant, a woman who thrived on office gossip, would see the papers and relay the information straight to the executive suite. The bait was set. I packed a small overnight bag and drove to the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The flight to Chicago was short, but it gave me time to calculate my next moves. The rival firm operated out of a sleek glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Their chief executive offered me a generous compensation package, a signing bonus, and full creative control over their new industrial product line. It was an objective upgrade from my current situation. Yet sitting in that pristine office, I felt nothing but a hollow ache. Sinclair Heavy Industries was not just a job, it was my heritage. I declined the offer politely, citing personal reasons, but I made sure the rival executive's rumor mill would broadcast my visit back to Detroit. The deception worked better than I could have anticipated. Believing I had surrendered and was actively seeking employment out of state, Preston dropped all remaining caution. He felt invincible. With my shadow removed from the factory floor, he decided it was time to solidify his reputation as the new visionary leader of the company. Late that evening, I sat in my hotel room in Chicago staring at my laptop screen. My mobile phone buzzed. It was David, a loyal systems engineer who maintained the secure drafting servers back in Detroit. David had worked alongside me for 5 years and despised the new corporate regime. He informed me that someone was currently attempting to breach the restricted product development archives. I asked David to monitor the intrusion without blocking it. We watched the digital logs update in real time. Preston was clumsy. He failed the biometric prompts and ultimately used my father's executive override codes to bypass the security firewalls. He navigated straight to the folder containing my most guarded project, the revolutionary high-pressure fuel housing. I had spent 2 grueling years perfecting that geometry, optimizing the fluid dynamics, and calculating the exact thermal tolerances. Preston downloaded the raw drafting files onto an external drive. He was planning to present my prototype to the visiting delegation of Ford executives as his own brilliant innovation. He needed a major victory to justify his sudden promotion, and securing a lucrative supply contract with a Tier 1 automotive buyer would cement his status. But Preston possessed a fatal flaw. He viewed engineering as a simple copy and paste exercise. He did not understand the fundamental physics breathing life into those digital blueprints. David sent me the manufacturing orders Preston submitted to the fabrication floor. My stomach twisted into a tight knot as I read the material specifications. My original design mandated the use of aerospace-grade titanium. That specific metal was non-negotiable due to the extreme atmospheric strain the component would endure. Preston, seeking to maximize his quarterly bonus and impress my father with unprecedented profit margins, altered the manufacturing instructions. He ordered the prototype to be cast using the cheap, standard aluminum from the fraudulent shell company Valerie and I had discovered earlier. I pulled out a notepad and began running the metallurgical equations. The math was cold and unforgiving. The required testing protocol demanded the fuel housing withstand 10,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. The tensile yield strength of the substandard aluminum Preston sourced would begin to warp at 7,000. At 8,000, the thermal load would cause the atomic structure of the metal to destabilize. Long before it reached the final testing threshold, the aluminum would literally liquefy and rupture. It was the perfect trap. Preston was engineering his own spectacular downfall. He scheduled a private, high-stakes pressure test at the Sinclair Proving Grounds, aiming to dazzle the buyers with a live demonstration. He invited my father and the entire executive board to witness his triumph. By stealing my design and substituting the materials, he was walking blindly onto a public stage holding a lit fuse. However, a dark realization crept into my mind. A test of that magnitude required human operators. The automated testing bay was shielded by reinforced acrylic glass, but the technicians running the diagnostic equipment would be stationed mere feet from the containment chamber. Big Joe and his crew would be the ones physically hooking up the hydraulic lines and monitoring the pressure valves. If that prototype detonated under 8,000 pounds of pressure, the resulting blast radius would send jagged metal shrapnel and boiling hydraulic fluid tearing through the immediate vicinity. I wanted Preston to fail. I wanted my father to witness the catastrophic incompetence of his chosen successor. But I could not allow innocent workers to pay the price for corporate vanity. I paced the floor of my hotel room, the neon lights of the Chicago skyline casting long shadows across the carpet. I had to orchestrate a safety measure from 300 miles away without tipping off my cousin. If I called my father and warned him, he would assume I was acting out of spite. He would ignore the warning and proceed with the demonstration just to prove me wrong. If I contacted Preston directly, he would accuse me of trying to sabotage his big moment. I picked up my phone and dialed Big Joe. The veteran foreman answered on the second ring, his voice rough from decades of inhaling factory dust. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Joe that Preston stole my fuel housing design. I told him about the material swap and the impending pressure test. I explained the exact mathematical certainty of the failure. Joe listened in grim silence. He knew my engineering instincts were never wrong. I instructed him to prep the testing bay as requested by Preston, but with one crucial modification. I told Joe to discreetly replace the standard diagnostic cables with our extended range wiring harness. This would allow the floor team to operate the control panels from the secondary bunker, located 50 yards away from the primary blast zone. I also ordered him to ensure the secondary blast shields were quietly engaged before the executives arrived. Joe agreed without hesitation. He promised to keep the floor team safe and to let the corporate suits stand in the observation deck above the bay. They would have a front row seat to their own disaster. I ended the call and booked the first flight back to Detroit for the following morning. The pieces were moving into position. Preston thought he was constructing an empire, but he was merely assembling a guillotine. The following days would require perfect timing and iron discipline. I had to return to Michigan and watch the destruction unfold from the shadows, ensuring the collateral damage only struck the men who deserved it. The flight back from Chicago touched down on the frozen tarmac of Detroit Metropolitan Airport just as the sun broke through a thick layer of industrial smog. I walked through the terminal with a heavy heart and a singular focus. Big Joe had confirmed the secondary blast shields were operational and the extended wiring harness was properly installed. The working-class men and women of the factory floor were safe from the physical blast radius. However, the impending destruction of the high-pressure fuel housing would still inflict profound damage upon Sinclair Heavy Industries. A failed demonstration in front of elite automotive buyers would obliterate our reputation. It would trigger a cascade of canceled contracts, resulting in widespread layoffs. I could not stand by and let my grandfather's enterprise crumble without making one final attempt to stop the madness. I needed to bypass my father and Preston entirely. They were deaf to reason and blinded by their own unchecked ambition. I required an audience with a board member who possessed enough historical leverage to halt the demonstration. I chose Elias. Elias was a senior director who had worked alongside my grandfather during the foundational years of the business. He understood the uncompromising nature of raw steel and high-pressure systems. If anyone possessed the authority to challenge Richard, it was him. I parked my truck down the block from the corporate tower and waited in the biting cold of the executive parking garage. The concrete structure echoed with the low hum of luxury engines and the sharp click of leather shoes. After 2 hours of waiting in the shadows, I saw Elias walking toward his pristine sedan. His shoulders were stooped, carrying the invisible weight of a lifetime spent navigating corporate politics. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, blocking his path to the driver's side door. Elias flinched, dropping his briefcase. When he recognized me, a flash of guilt crossed his weathered face. He looked around nervously, terrified that my father's security detail might spot us together. I did not waste time with pleasantries or apologies for the ambush. I pulled a rolled schematic from my jacket pocket and spread it across the hood of his car. I laid out the thermal dynamics of the prototype in agonizing, uncompromising detail. I pointed to the specific geometric stress points of the containment vessel. I explained how my original design relied on aerospace-grade titanium to absorb the immense thermal load generated by 10,000 pounds of pressure. Then I revealed Preston's fatal modification. I told Elias about the substandard aluminum alloy Preston procured from the fraudulent shell company. I did not speak in hypothetical scenarios. I presented pure mathematical certainty. I explained that standard aluminum possesses a distinct tensile yield threshold. At 7,000 pounds per square inch, the internal crystalline structure of that specific metal begins to deform. The casing would warp, disrupting the fluid dynamics within the chamber. At 8,000 pounds, the friction generated by the escaping hydraulic fluid would spike the internal temperature. Long before the pressure gauges ever reached the 10,000 mark, the aluminum would lose all structural integrity. It would melt and rupture, sending boiling fluid and shrapnel tearing through the testing bay. I pleaded with him to use his seniority to cancel the demonstration. I told him he had an ethical obligation to protect the company from Preston's staggering incompetence. Elias stared at the blueprints. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the failure points with his index finger. He knew my calculations were flawless. He knew the disaster was inevitable. Yet he slowly rolled up the schematic and handed it back to me. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. He told me Richard had made his decision and the board was bound to support the chief executive. Elias confessed that his pension and his stock options were tied up in a pending corporate restructuring. If he crossed my father now, he risked losing everything he had accumulated over 4 decades. He traded his courage for comfort. He whispered that he could not intervene and quickly slid into the safety of his luxury vehicle. I stood in the dim garage watching his taillights fade into the distance. The dramatic irony was suffocating. I held the exact knowledge required to save the company, but the men in charge were paralyzed by their own greed. I was locked out of the system entirely, reduced to the role of a helpless spectator. My warning was ignored, setting the stage for the catastrophic event I had predicted. The morning of the demonstration arrived with a bitter, punishing wind blowing off the Detroit River. Since my security badge had been deactivated, I could not enter the proving grounds through the main gate. I drove my truck down a neglected service road and parked near the rusted perimeter fence. I climbed onto the hood of my vehicle, pulling my collar up against the cold. From this vantage point, I possessed a clear view of the reinforced testing bay and the elevated VIP observation deck. The scene unfolded exactly as I feared. A fleet of sleek black town cars pulled into the compound. The delegation of Tier 1 executives emerged, including Marcus, the pragmatic industry veteran I had spoken with at the gala. My father greeted them with forced enthusiasm, shaking hands and pointing toward the testing chamber. Preston strutted behind him, wearing a crisp white hard hat that gleamed under the gray winter sky. Preston looked incredibly smug, eager to present my stolen design as the crowning achievement of his fabricated career. The executives filed into the observation deck, safely positioned behind 3 inches of bulletproof acrylic glass. Preston picked up a radio and gave the signal to commence the pressure sequence. Down on the floor, I could see Big Joe and his crew safely positioned in the secondary bunker, executing the commands via the extended wiring harness I had instructed them to install. The technicians were safe, but the hardware was doomed. Warning sirens blared across the compound, signaling the start of the pressurization cycle. A deep mechanical hum vibrated through the frozen ground beneath my boots. Above the testing bay, a large digital display illuminated, showing the real-time pressure metrics in bright amber numerals. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. The numbers climbed steadily. Inside the observation deck, Preston smiled, pointing at the prototype with unearned pride. My father nodded, attempting to look like the visionary leader of a modern manufacturing empire. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes analyzing the equipment. 6,000. 7,000. Right on cue, the pitch of the machinery shifted. A high, shrill whine cut through the cold air. It was the sound of stressed metal begging for relief. I gripped the chain-link fence, my knuckles turning white. I knew the internal structure of the aluminum was currently deforming. The geometry of the valve was collapsing under the immense strain. 8,000. A thin jet of white-hot vapor hissed from the side of the housing. The technicians in the bunker stopped increasing the throttle. Through the acrylic glass, I saw Preston wave his hand frantically, ordering them to push the machine harder. He needed to hit the 10,000 mark to satisfy the contract requirements. He possessed no understanding of the warning signs right in front of his face. 8,400. The metal gave way. A deafening roar shattered the morning silence. The prototype erupted in a blinding flash of torn steel and atomized fluid. The shockwave rattled the perimeter fence and set off car alarms across the parking lot. A heavy chunk of shrapnel slammed into the bulletproof glass of the observation deck, leaving a profound spiderweb fracture directly in front of Preston's face. Inside the deck, chaos reigned. The Ford executives threw themselves to the floor, terrified by the concussive force of the blast. Thick black smoke billowed from the ruined test engine, obscuring the bay. Emergency sprinkler systems engaged, raining chemical foam down onto the smoldering wreckage. I did not flinch. I stood on the hood of my truck and watched the smoke rise into the gray Michigan sky. The failure was profound and undeniable. As the smoke began to clear, I saw Marcus and his delegation stand up. They brushed the dust from their expensive coats. My father tried to speak to them, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. Preston was frozen in place, staring blankly at the cracked glass. Marcus did not yell. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply turned his back on my father and led his entire team out of the observation deck. They walked down the stairs, entered their waiting vehicles, and drove away without a single backward glance. They took millions of dollars in pending contracts and the last shred of our corporate dignity with them. The nightmare, however, was far from over. As I climbed down from my truck, I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. My father and Preston were narcissists. They would never accept the blame for a failure of this magnitude. They would immediately begin hunting for a scapegoat to absorb the public fallout and shield their fragile egos. I knew with absolute certainty that they were going to point the finger at me. I had to prepare for a swift and brutal retaliation. The war was about to escalate beyond stolen designs and into the realm of criminal accusations. The hours following the destruction of the prototype dragged by with an agonizing slowness. I drove away from the perimeter fence of the proving grounds and navigated through the labyrinth of Detroit streets. The winter sky began to bruise, turning a deep shade of purple as the sun dipped below the industrial skyline. The ringing in my ears from the concussive blast eventually faded, but the heavy weight in my chest remained. My grandfather built a legacy based on precision and integrity. Watching it detonate into a cloud of shrapnel and chemical foam felt like attending a funeral. I returned to my modest brick house on the edge of the city, hoping to gather my thoughts and consult with Valerie. Before I could even unlock my front door, a sleek black courier vehicle pulled into my driveway. A man wearing a tailored gray uniform stepped out and handed me a thick manila envelope sealed with the corporate crest of Sinclair Heavy Industries. I did not need to open it to know what it contained. It was a formal summons to the executive suite. The timing was predictable. The automotive executives had fled the facility, taking their millions of dollars in pending contracts with them. The financial fallout was imminent, and Richard Sinclair was a man who refused to absorb the consequences of his own disastrous choices. He needed a scapegoat to offer the board of directors and the media. I changed out of my canvas work jacket and put on a dark, tailored suit. I wanted to face my father on his own terms. I drove to the downtown corporate tower as the streetlights flickered to life, reflecting off the patches of black ice on the pavement. The security guards in the lobby usually offered a warm greeting, but tonight they averted their eyes. The electronic turnstiles beeped a harsh warning when I scanned my identification badge. My access to the manufacturing levels had been revoked. The only button functioning on the elevator panel was the one leading straight to the executive boardroom. The doors slid open, revealing a suffocating atmosphere. The air inside the mahogany boardroom felt heavy and sterile, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and sheer panic. My father stood at the head of the long table, his face flushed with a humiliating, uncontainable rage. He had built his entire identity around the illusion of corporate perfection, and today, that illusion shattered in front of the most powerful buyers in the industry. Preston sat near the window, gripping a crystal glass of scotch. His knuckles were pale. He looked like a cornered animal trying to mimic the posture of a predator. They were not alone. 3 unfamiliar men sat opposite Preston, their expensive briefcases open on the polished wood. These were not the loyal in-house attorneys my grandfather employed. The old guard believed that a handshake sealed the deal and that honesty prevented litigation. My father preferred a different breed of counsel. He hired slick, expensive mercenaries who specialized in burying corporate mistakes and silencing whistleblowers. The presence of this new, ruthless legal team signaled a profound shift in the rules of engagement. We were no longer having a family dispute. We were entering a theater of war. My father did not offer a greeting. He bypassed any pretense of a corporate inquiry and launched directly into a scripted accusation. He slammed his fist against the table, demanding my attention. He pointed a trembling finger at me and stated that I altered the drafting files before I went to Chicago. He claimed I engineered the failure out of bitter jealousy over Preston's promotion. I stared at him, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. I looked at Preston, who refused to meet my gaze. My cousin had clearly panicked in the hours following the explosion. Realizing the independent automotive auditors would eventually test the melted slag and discover his substandard aluminum, Preston initiated a frantic cover-up. He used my father's override codes to falsify the server access logs, making it look like my remote terminal initiated the material swap. But falsifying the digital footprints was only half the battle. Preston also needed to silence the third-party testing firm hired to certify the results. I noticed a fresh ledger sheet resting near the lawyers' briefcases. It documented an exorbitant emergency consulting fee paid to the lead metallurgical investigator. Preston had bribed the external auditor to sign a sworn affidavit blaming a geometric design flaw rather than a material deficiency. They constructed a fabricated narrative, placing the entirety of the blame squarely on my shoulders before the Ford executives could launch their own independent inquiry. The lead attorney adjusted his silk tie and slid a dense stack of legal documents across the expansive table. The crisp white paper stopped inches from my hands. He spoke in a smooth, practiced tone devoid of any human empathy. He explained that Sinclair Heavy Industries possessed enough circumstantial evidence to pursue a federal indictment for corporate sabotage. He outlined the potential prison sentences and the financial ruin that awaited me if the company handed the falsified server logs to the authorities. Then my father presented his ultimatum. He stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of his leather chair. He told me I had a choice. I could sign the confession admitting I sabotaged the prototype to humiliate my cousin. Attached to the confession was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement permanently silencing me from speaking about the company. The final document was a binding forfeiture agreement surrendering my minority board shares back to the executive trust. If I signed my life away, he promised to withhold the criminal charges. The betrayal hung in the air heavy and absolute. Richard Sinclair was looking at his own daughter, ready to send her to a concrete cell just to protect a lie. He was willing to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance to shield a lazy, incompetent nephew from the consequences of his own greed. My grandfather poured his sweat and his soul into the foundation of this enterprise. He built something real and enduring. Now his own son was leveraging the corporate legal department to perform a bloodless execution. Preston finally looked up from his glass of scotch. A faint, smug smile returned to his lips. He believed the sheer weight of the legal threats would crush my resolve. He expected me to break down to cry and to beg my father for mercy. He thought I would sign the papers just to avoid the terrifying prospect of a federal courtroom. I looked at the documents. I read the bold, printed words demanding my surrender. I did not reach for the expensive silver pen resting beside the papers. I did not attempt to argue the metallurgy or point out the obvious discrepancies in their fabricated timeline. Engaging in a screaming match with a man who had already decided your guilt is a profound waste of breath. I raised my head and looked directly into my father's eyes. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of doubt behind his angry facade. He recognized the cold, unbreakable determination staring back at him. I buttoned my suit jacket, turned on my heel, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. The lawyers exchanged confused glances. Preston stood up, knocking his chair backward. My father raised his voice, his tone cracking with genuine frustration. He yelled across the length of the boardroom, warning me that the offer expired at sunset tomorrow. He shouted that I had exactly 24 hours to sign the forfeiture, or he would call the police. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway without saying a single word. The heavy oak slammed shut behind me, sealing them inside their echo chamber of lies. I walked toward the elevator banks, the rhythm of my footsteps steady and calm. The clock was officially ticking. I was entirely stripped of my operational authority, my access badges were dead, and the legal machinery of a billion-dollar corporation was currently hunting me. To an outside observer, I was a woman entirely out of options. But as the elevator descended toward the ground floor, I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket. I had 24 hours to tear their empire down, and I knew exactly where to find the ammunition. I just needed to secure a ride. The freezing wind whipped across the barren concrete plaza as I exited the towering glass monolith of the corporate headquarters. The heavy revolving doors sealed shut behind me, locking away my entire professional existence. The cold reality of my precarious situation began setting in, settling deep within my bones. I possessed exactly 24 hours before my own father permanently stripped my heritage and handed me over to federal prosecutors. The city streets were relatively deserted, save for a few weary pedestrians bracing against the bitter Michigan winter. Just as I pulled my wool collar tight against my neck, a massive black Lincoln Town Car rolled silently to a stop beside the illuminated curb. The vehicle was a relic of a bygone era, pristine and imposing. The heavy tinted passenger window glided down, revealing the weathered, sharp profile of Thomas Holden. Holden served as my late grandfather's fiercely loyal, old-school corporate attorney. He was a man who despised Richard's vanity and had observed our enterprise's recent operational decline with a silent, terrifying fury. He did not offer a polite greeting or a sympathetic smile. "Get in," he grunted, his voice resembling gravel grinding against steel. I opened the heavy passenger door and slid into the immaculate leather interior. The cabin smelled of rich tobacco and aged cedar, a comforting sensory reminder of the days when true leaders commanded the boardroom. The driver accelerated smoothly, merging into the sparse evening traffic. We navigated through the gritty industrial corridors of Detroit, passing darkened warehouses and dormant stamping plants. Holden reached into his tailored tweed jacket and retrieved a small velvet pouch. He untied the delicate silken drawstrings and handed me a heavy, antique brass key. The metal felt dense and freezing against my palm. Its intricate teeth were cut with a precision rarely seen in modern manufacturing. Your grandfather always knew Richard was a peacock, Holden stated softly, his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights. He knew Preston was nothing more than a parasite, feeding off the labor of better men. He did not trust those two with the soul of this magnificent operation. I stared at the brass artifact, turning it over under the dim cabin illumination. My grandfather built the conglomerate from a single mechanized lathe into a global powerhouse. He understood human nature just as deeply as he understood metallurgy. Holden leaned closer, lowering his tone to a conspiratorial whisper. He revealed a closely guarded secret that fundamentally altered the landscape of my impending war. The modern corporate bylaws, the very legal documents Richard's expensive mercenary lawyers intended to use against me, were completely superseded by a singular, irrevocable failsafe. Decades ago, the founder placed a golden share into a heavily encrypted blind trust. This unique equity mechanism granted its holder absolute dictatorial voting authority over the entire board of directors. It possessed the power to instantly nullify any executive action, including hostile terminations and forced stock forfeitures. The activation protocol for this hidden share is concealed within the original 1982 incorporation ledger, Holden explained. That bound historical volume is currently resting inside a maximum security downtown safety deposit box. Accessing that specific vault requires two distinct elements. It mandates your exact biometric fingerprint scan alongside the physical insertion of that brass mechanism you are currently holding. A surge of adrenaline momentarily pushed back my exhaustion. This was the ultimate trump card. Find the ledger, Briar Holden warned, his expression turning grim. But you must move incredibly fast. If Richard formalizes your forfeiture tomorrow morning, the legal trust automatically dissolves. The failsafe dies the moment you officially lose your minority status. We faced a monumental obstacle, however. My father possessed immense resources, and he was exceptionally thorough. While sitting in the Lincoln, I accessed my mobile banking application. A stark red banner confirmed my worst fear. Richard had already initiated a preemptive freeze on all my financial assets, utilizing a fabricated corporate fraud injunction. This malicious action flagged my digital identity across the entire regional banking network. I cannot simply walk into the First Michigan Depository, I told the elderly attorney. The second I place my thumb on their biometric scanner, the system will trigger a silent alarm, alerting my father's legal team. They will have police waiting at the exit before I can even open the metal box. Holden frowned, tapping his silver cane against the floorboards. Then we require high-level internal clearance, he deduced. Someone possessing the administrative authority to temporarily blind the security grid without leaving a digital footprint. I knew exactly who to call. I instructed the driver to divert our route toward the affluent historic district of Palmer Woods. We were going to visit Maya. Maya is my brilliant, sophisticated sister-in-law, an African-American woman who shattered every glass ceiling in the Midwestern financial sector. She married my older brother long before he wisely abandoned the toxic family dynamics to pursue academia. Maya currently served as the regional director of vault operations for the depository network. She harbored a deep-seated disdain for Richard and Preston, who had always treated her with thinly veiled condescension at holiday gatherings. She tolerated their arrogance with aristocratic grace, but I knew she relished any opportunity to outsmart them. We arrived at her elegant Tudor-style home just as a light snow began to fall. Maya opened the heavy oak door wearing a luxurious cashmere wrap over her evening clothes. She took one look at my tense posture and Holden's grim demeanor, immediately understanding the gravity of our unannounced visit. She ushered us into her warmly lit study, offering no hollow pleasantries. I explained the catastrophic events at the proving grounds, the fabricated sabotage accusations, and the ticking 24-hour deadline. I showed her the brass key and detailed the grandfather clause hidden within the downtown facility. I needed her to bypass the biometric lockdown so I could extract the incorporation registry. Maya listened intently, her sharp, analytical mind processing the monumental risks. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, setting them gently on her mahogany desk. Richard is attempting a hostile amputation, she noted, her voice smooth but laced with undeniable authority. He assumes he controls the entire chessboard because he bought a few expensive rooks. He severely underestimates the power of the queens. She walked over to her secure home terminal, rapidly typing a series of complex administrative commands. Maya possessed a fierce intellect and an unparalleled mastery of financial security architectures. She explained that she could reroute the biometric verification ping, diverting it from the central fraud database to a localized, encrypted server located exclusively within her administrative control. This temporary blind spot would last exactly 7 minutes. Once the window closed, the system would reboot and the standard alarms would reactivate. We have to execute this extraction tonight, Maya decided, grabbing her tailored wool coat. I am coming with you. If the branch manager questions our late arrival, my presence as the regional director will silence any bureaucratic hesitation. The three of us returned to the idling Lincoln speeding toward the financial district. The towering granite facade of the depository loomed like an impenetrable fortress. A lone security guard unlocked the glass perimeter doors when he recognized Maya's elite credentials. She smoothly fabricated a narrative about an emergency executive audit, guiding us past the marble lobby and down into the subterranean vault levels. The air grew noticeably colder as we descended. A massive circular steel door guarded the secure boxes. Maya swiped her master access card, initiating the hydraulic locks. The heavy metal barrier swung open with a deep, resonant hum, revealing rows of polished stainless steel compartments. Box 412, Holden whispered, his breathing slightly labored from the mounting tension. We approached the designated compartment. Maya accessed her tablet, initiating the 7-minute security blackout. A green light pulsed on the interface. You are clear, Breyer, she said, stepping back. Make it count. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing biometric sensor. A grueling second passed before the digital screen flashed an affirmative green checkmark. I inserted the brass key into the mechanical lock, turning it clockwise. A satisfying, heavy click echoed through the silent vault. I pulled the long metal drawer outward. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, lay the 1982 incorporation ledger. It was a thick volume bound in dark crimson leather. I carefully lifted the heavy registry, feeling the weight of my grandfather's legacy resting in my hands. I opened the cover, expecting to find standard legal documents detailing the Golden Share Protocol. Instead, a loose folded document slipped from the pages and fluttered to the pristine tile floor. Maya leaned down and retrieved the heavy parchment. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the typed paragraphs. Suddenly, all the color drained from her confident expression. "Breyer," she whispered, handing the paper to me. Her hands were visibly trembling. "This is not just a voting failsafe." I read the words printed on the aged stationery. The Golden Share Activation Protocol required a secondary countersignature. The failsafe could only be triggered if the hostile entity attempting to dismantle the company was identified as a direct blood relative. My grandfather knew Richard would eventually destroy the empire from within. But the shocking twist lay in the final paragraph. The blind trust holding the Golden Share was not managed by Thomas Holden. It was managed by Marcus Thorne, the very same pragmatic automotive executive who had just walked out of our ruined testing facility hours earlier. My grandfather had secretly appointed his oldest, fiercest industry rival as the ultimate guardian of our family legacy. Marcus did not leave the proving grounds today because he was disgusted. He left because he was waiting for me to bring him the Crimson Ledger. The actual war had barely begun. The early morning light bled across the frozen Detroit skyline, casting long gray shadows against the frosted windows of our secure location. Maya and Thomas had departed hours ago to quietly mobilize their respective networks within the financial district, leaving me alone with the Crimson Registry. My exhaustion vanished entirely, replaced by a singular, sharp focus. I needed my most trusted ally for the next crucial phase of this operation. I contacted Valerie. She arrived shortly before sunrise, carrying a heavy canvas bag filled with sophisticated computing hardware. Valerie possessed a brilliant analytical mind, honed during her years as an independent forensic accountant for several major logistics firms. She grew up in the working-class neighborhoods surrounding our primary production facility. Her father had spent 3 decades operating a heavy stamping press on our factory floor. She understood deeply that this escalating conflict was not merely a dispute over corporate stock or executive titles. It was a battle for the survival of an entire community. While I carefully turned the fragile pages of my grandfather's historical text, Valerie established a secure, encrypted connection on her customized tablet. She initiated a complex digital sweep, attempting to penetrate the executive firewall surrounding the corporate tower. During our previous clandestine investigations, she had successfully logged the unique hardware identifiers of my cousin's personal devices. Now, she prepared to execute a brilliant and highly illegal maneuver. She utilized specialized software to perfectly mirror the specific network address of his primary burner laptop. The glowing screen suddenly flooded with raw data streams. Valerie rapidly sorted through hidden email directories and off-book financial statements. She bypassed the standard accounting software, digging straight into the hidden server partitions that Preston believed were entirely untraceable. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, breaking the absolute silence of the room. I looked up from the heavy volume, watching her expression shift from intense concentration to pure, unadulterated horror. She pushed the glowing tablet across the wooden table toward me. What we found within those stolen digital files completely redefined the scope of our impending war. It was a staggering plot twist that caused my blood to run completely cold. I had always assumed my cousin acted alone in his clumsy embezzlement schemes. I believed he was foolishly stealing from the operational budget, while my father remained blindly ignorant of the structural decay. That assumption was tragically incorrect. Richard Sinclair knew absolutely everything. The digital evidence was irrefutable. My father was deliberately permitting the ongoing theft. He actively encouraged the use of substandard materials and the constant falsification of mandatory safety reports. He wanted the profit margins to appear artificially inflated on the quarterly financial ledgers. Richard was meticulously dressing the enterprise up for a catastrophic liquidation event. The intercepted internal emails revealed highly classified negotiations with a massive overseas holding company. He was orchestrating a secret hostile buyout. My father intended to sell the entire legacy of Sinclair Heavy Industries to a foreign conglomerate, liquidating every single physical asset we owned. The terms of the pending international agreement were absolutely sickening. The foreign buyers demanded a complete structural reorganization before they would transfer the funds. They intended to shutter the domestic manufacturing plants permanently. They planned to fire the entire blue-collar workforce and move all future production to overseas facilities where labor laws were non-existent. In exchange for facilitating this total destruction, Richard would receive a monumental golden parachute. The payout would secure his luxury lifestyle for the rest of his natural life. He was willing to sacrifice thousands of loyal local families just to secure a massive personal fortune. The betrayal ran much deeper than simple negligence or executive arrogance. It was calculated, malicious treason against the very people who built his empire from the ground up. A profound rage settled over me, cold and sharp as cracked winter ice. I turned my attention back to the aged leather book resting beside the tablet. My grandfather's meticulous handwriting filled every page, detailing the foundational rules of his creation. I scanned the dense legal language, searching for the specific mechanism Thomas mentioned in the car. I needed the exact protocol to empower Marcus and trigger the fail-safe mechanism. The morning sun finally pierced the heavy winter clouds, illuminating the yellowed parchment and casting a golden hue over the antique ink. Then I finally saw it. Page 42, paragraph 7. The text was slightly faded, but the original intent remained absolute. It was designated as the Founder's Clause. My breath caught in my throat as I read the precise stipulations allowed to Valerie. The clause explicitly stated that if the current chief executive attempted to dissolve the domestic manufacturing footprint without unanimous board approval, the minority stakeholders possessed the right to initiate an immediate emergency tribunal. Furthermore, It granted the designated independent trustee full legal authority to seize operational control and freeze all pending corporate asset transfers. Armed with the irrefutable digital proof of the overseas conspiracy, the falsified safety test results, and the physical historical registry, we finally possessed the necessary ammunition to strike back. We held the undisputed power to destroy Richard's massive golden parachute and send them both to a federal courtroom for blatant corporate fraud. I closed the heavy leather cover, feeling a sudden rush of victorious anticipation. The strategic pieces were perfectly aligned. We simply needed to deliver this mountain of evidence to Marcus before the corporate mercenary attorneys finalized my forced resignation at sunset. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of my mobile phone shattered the quiet, triumphant atmosphere. The caller identification displayed a familiar name. It was Big Joe. I answered the device, expecting a routine update regarding the ongoing cleanup efforts at the ruined proving grounds. Instead, I heard the chaotic, terrifying sounds of shouting and heavy machinery echoing loudly in the background. Joe's voice trembled with a mixture of raw panic and profound, uncharacteristic anger. He was completely out of breath, speaking in hurried, fragmented sentences that barely made sense at first. He told me that a fleet of black luxury vehicles had just surrounded the primary manufacturing facility. Preston had arrived unannounced with a large team of armed private security contractors and a thick stack of immediate termination notices. My cousin was currently marching across the main factory floor, indiscriminately firing anyone remotely associated with the failed pressure demonstration. He was violently cleaning house, attempting to eliminate all potential witnesses before the independent automotive auditors could arrive to inspect the melted prototype. He already fired the veteran shift supervisors, the diagnostic technicians, and the specialized maintenance crew. The private guards were physically dragging loyal, seasoned workers out of the building and throwing their personal belongings into the snowy parking lot. My father had clearly authorized a desperate, ruthless purge to cover their tracks. The carefully planned legal strategy we just discovered suddenly collapsed into an immediate, violent crisis. I could not sit comfortably in a secure room waiting to assemble a formal boardroom tribunal while my people were being thrown onto the frozen street. We had to abandon caution and head directly toward the escalating chaos at the factory. Valerie pressed the accelerator to the floor, sending her sleek sedan tearing through the slush-covered streets of the industrial sector. The winter landscape blurred past the windows, forming a gray streak of dormant facilities and chain-link fences. My heart hammered against my ribs with a steady, punishing rhythm. We were racing against a ticking clock and a desperate man. Preston was backed into a tight corner. The ruined prototype and the departing executives had shattered his fragile corporate facade. Now he was behaving like a trapped predator, lashing out at the most vulnerable targets to save his own skin. The Sinclair Heavy Industries main manufacturing plant soon loomed on the horizon. Normally, the twin exhaust stacks churned white steam into the Michigan sky, signaling the relentless, productive heartbeat of the city. Today, the sky above the facility remained stark and empty. The heavy stamping presses were silent. The automated assembly tracks were dead. A factory deprived of its noise feels like a tomb. We bypassed the administrative parking lot and skidded to a halt near the rear loading docks. I threw the passenger door open before the vehicle even stopped moving. The frigid air hit my face, but I barely registered the cold. I marched toward the heavy steel employee entrance with Valerie matching my determined stride. She carried a pristine black leather portfolio under her arm, containing the damning financial evidence we just extracted from the digital archives. I pushed the heavy metal doors open and stepped onto the sprawling concrete floor. The sheer scale of the facility usually inspired a sense of profound pride. Right now, it served as an arena for a brutal standoff. A crowd of over 100 blue-collar workers had formed a dense barricade near the primary quality control station. These were the men and women who breathed life into my designs. They wore grease-stained coveralls and heavy protective boots. They stood shoulder to shoulder, holding wrenches and steel pipes in a silent, terrifying display of collective defiance. In the center of the hostile circle stood Preston. He looked entirely out of place, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes on a floor meant for hard labor. He was flanked by 6 private security contractors. These guards wore tactical vests and rested their hands on their holstered weapons, projecting an intimidating but foolish presence. You do not threaten Detroit machinists on their own turf and expect them to simply surrender. Preston was shouting. His face was flushed a deep mottled crimson, and a frantic sweat coated his forehead. He waved a thick stack of pink termination slips in the air like a weapon. He was directing his venom specifically at Big Joe. Joe stood at the front of the worker barricade, unmoving and stoic. Joe had dedicated 35 years of his life to this enterprise. He put 2 daughters through nursing school, working grueling double shifts on these very floors. His pension was just a few short years away. Preston was attempting to strip all of that away in a matter of seconds. My cousin pointed his manicured finger at the veteran foreman. He accused Joe of gross negligence. He yelled that the quality control team intentionally swapped the aerospace titanium for substandard aluminum to sabotage the company. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. Preston was trying to bury his own fatal procurement decisions by terminating the only people who could testify against him. He warned the crowd that anyone refusing to return to their stations immediately would join Joe on the unemployment line. The workers responded by striking their heavy tools against the steel workbenches. The rhythmic, metallic clanging echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, drowning out Preston's empty threats. The situation teetered on the very edge of physical conflict. The security guards shifted nervously, recognizing they were hopelessly outnumbered by a workforce pushed to its breaking point. I stepped forward, letting my steel-toed boots strike the concrete with heavy, deliberate purpose. The sharp sound caught the attention of the nearest machinist. He tapped the shoulder of the woman beside him. A ripple of recognition swept through the hostile crowd. The metallic clanging slowly faded into a tense, expectant silence. The dense wall of workers shifted, parting down the middle, to create a clear path for me. I walked through the human corridor, keeping my posture rigid and my gaze locked directly onto my cousin. Preston swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously as he watched me approach. He tried to straighten his posture, but his underlying fear was palpable. "Stand down, Joe," I commanded, my voice echoing clearly across the vast, silent room. I did not yell. I projected a calm, unwavering authority that cut straight through the lingering chaos. Joe turned his head, offering a brief, respectful nod. He lowered his defensive stance, signaling the rest of the crew to ease their tension. I stepped between the veteran foreman and the private security contractors, shielding the workers with my own presence. I turned my attention to Preston. He attempted to sneer, opening his mouth to issue another desperate threat. I raised my hand, silencing him, before he could utter a single syllable. "You have no jurisdiction here, Breyer," he stammered, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "The board removed your operational authority. You are trespassing on private property. Guards, escort her out." The tactical contractors hesitated, glancing nervously at the surrounding crowd of machinists who immediately tightened their circle. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a folded legal document. I held it up for Preston and his hired mercenaries to see. "My father may have stripped my daily operational title," I explained, keeping my tone dangerously even, "but he cannot legally confiscate my minority shareholder equity until the formal board vote tomorrow morning. Until that gavel falls, I retain full executive standing within this corporation." Preston narrowed his eyes, unsure of the legal maneuver I was about to execute. "Pursuant to Section 4 of the corporate bylaws," I continued, "I am officially invoking an emergency executive stay on all personnel changes. Every single termination you just issued is hereby suspended. This entire factory floor is frozen, pending a formal review by the Ethics Committee. You cannot fire anyone today, Preston." His face contorted into an ugly grimace of pure frustration. He crumpled the pink slips in his hand, throwing them onto the oil-stained floor. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me. "You are just delaying the inevitable," he hissed his breath, smelling stale and sour. "Tomorrow morning, Richard will finalize your expulsion. You will lose your shares, your title, and your protection. I will return here tomorrow afternoon and fire every single person who defied me today. You are a dead woman walking, Breyer." "We will see about that," I replied, my voice dropping to a quiet, chilling whisper. Before Preston could issue another pathetic insult, Valerie stepped out from behind my shoulder. She adjusted her glasses and fixed him with a stare so cold it could freeze the Detroit River. She opened her black leather portfolio and extracted a single sheet of paper. It was a printed summary of the offshore routing numbers we had mirrored from his burner laptop. Valerie held the paper just inches from his face. She did not raise her voice, but the clinical precision of her words carried a lethal weight. "I would start packing your office right now, Preston," she advised, offering a tight, humorless smile. Forensic auditors tend to make a rather spectacular mess when they tear through a procurement fraud. Preston's eyes darted down to the printed document. He recognized the account numbers instantly. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His jaw went slack, and his arrogant posture crumbled entirely. He realized in that profound moment that we possessed the exact financial trail connecting him to the compromised aluminum. He took a slow, trembling step backward. He looked at Valerie, then at me, and finally at the hundreds of silent workers watching his public humiliation. He did not say another word. He turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the loading dock exit, gesturing for his hired guards to follow. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, leaving the factory floor in our control. A deafening cheer erupted from the machinists. Big Joe stepped forward and wrapped me in a brief, fierce hug. The immediate crisis was averted, but I knew the victory was only temporary. Preston would run straight to my father, and Richard would accelerate his hostile buyout plans to escape the impending audit. I looked at Valerie, acknowledging the unspoken truth passing between us. We secured the factory, but the final battle required a much larger stage. Tonight was the annual Detroit Heavy Manufacturers Gala. Every major industrial player would be in attendance, including my father and the foreign buyers he was secretly courting. We needed to confront Richard in front of his peers, trap him in his own web of lies, and prepare the ground for tomorrow morning's ultimate reckoning. The evening sky over Detroit transitioned into a deep, bruised purple as we approached the Grand Historical Hotel hosting the annual Heavy Manufacturers Gala. This opulent reception served as the ultimate high society gathering where automotive royalty mingled with industrial titans. Inside those gilded walls, fortunes were secured and legacies were dismantled over flutes of expensive vintage champagne. The contrast between the freezing, chaotic factory floor we secured earlier and this luxurious environment could not be more severe. I navigated the icy pavement wearing a meticulously tailored black suit. The structured fabric functioned as psychological armor, preparing me for the refined warfare awaiting us inside the grand ballroom. Valerie walked beside me, her posture rigid and alert. Valerie possessed a brilliant analytical mind, but she despised these aristocratic gatherings. She grew up in a working-class household where her father scrubbed industrial grease from his knuckles every single night. She understood the true cost of the wealth proudly displayed by the billionaires congregating in the lobby. I, on the other hand, was raised navigating these treacherous social waters. My childhood consisted of attending formal dinners where I learned to identify weakness disguised behind polite smiles and expensive designer gowns. I knew exactly how to manipulate the unspoken rules governing this elite echelon of society. We bypassed the sprawling lines at the coat check and ignored the superficial socialites mingling near the entrance. The soaring marble ceilings echoed with the harmonious notes of a live string quartet. The music provided a sophisticated auditory mask for the ruthless negotiations occurring in every corner of the magnificent room. I scanned the crowded floor, searching for our specific targets. It did not take long to locate them. Richard stood near a towering crystalline champagne display, radiating a desperate manufactured charm. He was aggressively attempting to execute severe damage control following the catastrophic morning demonstration. Beside him stood Preston, looking entirely out of his depth. My relative wore a tuxedo that cost more than a traditional blue-collar yearly salary, yet he appeared remarkably uncomfortable. A fine sheen of nervous perspiration coated his forehead, reflecting the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. They were actively parading around the ballroom, attempting to reassure nervous investors that the explosive failure was merely a minor developmental setback. They were currently cornering Marcus Thorne, the chief executive of the Ford automotive empire. Marcus was a formidable presence. He began his career decades ago sweeping metal shavings off a manufacturing floor before clawing his way up the corporate ladder. He possessed a profound respect for authentic craftsmanship and harbored a notorious disdain for empty executive rhetoric. He listened to the frantic reassurances of my patriarch with a stony, skeptical expression. Marcus understood the fundamental laws of physics, and he recognized a hollow excuse when he heard one. I guided Valerie through the dense throng of wealthy attendees, causing the crowd to part seamlessly around us. My sudden appearance in the ballroom sent a visible shockwave through the surrounding guests. Rumors regarding my forced exile and the impending federal charges had undoubtedly circulated throughout the afternoon. Stepping into this prestigious arena was an act of profound, open defiance. We intercepted the conversation just as Richard signaled a waiter for another round of drinks. The older man turned his head, and his confident facade instantly crumbled. His eyes widened, displaying sheer, unadulterated panic. He opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. He expected me to be hiding in a legal office, begging for leniency. He never anticipated I would confidently invade his most critical social sanctuary. I ignored his silent terror and focused my entire attention directly on the automotive magnate. I offered Marcus a respectful nod, bypassing standard introductions, and immediately diving into the core technical issue. I explained that the catastrophic rupture during the morning test resulted from a severe molecular degradation within the containment casing. I detailed how substituting aerospace-grade titanium with a commercial aluminum alloy fundamentally altered the thermal dynamic threshold of the entire engine block. I did not raise my voice or display any aggressive emotion. I spoke with a calm, clinical precision, projecting absolute authority over the subject matter. I described the exact tensile strength calculations required to sustain maximum combustion pressure. I pointed out that the substituted metal possessed a crystalline structure incapable of withstanding the rapid temperature fluctuations inherently generated by the new fuel injection system. I walked Marcus through the precise sequence of mechanical failures, proving my absolute mastery over the compromised prototype. Marcus listened intently, his initial skepticism transforming into genuine intellectual engagement. He nodded slowly, processing the complex metallurgical data I provided. He recognized that I was not offering excuses, but delivering a stark, factual analysis of a critical structural failure. He appreciated the unvarnished truth. While I commanded the conversation, Preston stood completely frozen. He opened his mouth several times, attempting to interject and defend his disastrous procurement decisions. However, he lacked the fundamental technical vocabulary necessary to participate in the discussion. He could only manage a few stuttered, disjointed syllables before falling back into a humiliating silence. He looked like a foolish child caught impersonating an adult. Richard attempted to salvage the situation by placing a heavy paternal hand on my shoulder. He forced a strained laugh, suggesting to Marcus that we should not bore him with tedious internal technicalities during a festive celebration. He tried to physically guide me away from the automotive titan. I smoothly sidestepped his grasp, maintaining my direct eye contact with Marcus. I concluded my analysis by stating that authentic innovation requires an uncompromising commitment to structural integrity. I emphasized that compromising material quality to artificially inflate short-term profit margins always results in catastrophic long-term failure. Marcus offered a rare, approving smile, acknowledging the validity of my assessment. He thanked me for the candid clarification, deliberately turning his back on my family members. The public execution was flawless. I had systematically dismantled their false narrative and humiliated Preston without ever losing my composure. The surrounding guests witnessed the entire exchange, recognizing a profound shift in the power dynamic. I turned gracefully, preparing to leave the defeated men standing in their own manufactured wreckage. Before walking away, I stepped intimately close to the man who orchestrated my downfall. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the acrid smell of his raw fear. I leaned in and whispered directly into his ear, ensuring nobody else could hear my words. I told him that I possessed the 1982 ledger. I promised I would see him at the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. I pulled back and watched the immediate physical reaction take hold of his body. His face went completely ashen, resembling a lifeless statue. The crystal champagne glass trembled violently in his hand, spilling the golden liquid over his expensive silk tie. The psychological warfare was absolute and complete. I had successfully planted a seed of total, uncontrollable terror deep within his mind. Valerie and I walked away, leaving them paralyzed near the champagne tower. The thrill of victory coursed through my veins, but it was suddenly interrupted by a chilling new discovery. As we moved toward the exit, I noticed a secluded alcove near the rear of the grand ballroom. A group of foreign investors sat around a polished mahogany table, reviewing a thick stack of legal documents. I recognized the corporate insignia printed on their briefcases from the hacked digital files Valerie uncovered earlier. Sitting directly across from the foreign representatives was the lead mercenary attorney hired just hours ago. He was sliding a gilded pen across the table, urging the investors to sign the preliminary acquisition contracts tonight. The terrifying reality washed over me instantly. Richard realized the board vote tomorrow morning was no longer guaranteed. He was accelerating the timeline, attempting to finalize the hostile buyout and secure his golden parachute right now under the cover of this elegant social gathering. The deadline was not tomorrow at sunrise. The final, desperate battle was happening right in front of my eyes, and I had seconds to stop an international transaction from destroying everything my grandfather built. The frigid morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy, overcast sky looming above the financial district. I stepped into the dedicated executive elevator, riding up to the 52nd floor of the Sinclair Heavy Industries global headquarters. The ascending steel cage offered a panoramic view of the frozen metropolis below. Valerie stood silently beside me, clutching her leather briefcase, which contained the intercepted international banking documents. We had successfully thwarted Richard's premature midnight deal by anonymously triggering the ballroom emergency sprinkler system. That chaotic deluge soaked the foreign representatives and utterly destroyed their preliminary physical contracts, forcing a mandatory delay. Now the ultimate battleground shifted back to our home turf. We entered the primary boardroom. The atmosphere inside the cavernous space was suffocatingly tense. The chamber was a testament to my grandfather's immense success, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass panels and a massive oval table carved from a single ancient mahogany tree. 12 high-backed leather chairs surrounded the imposing wooden structure. 7 independent directors already occupied their assigned seats. These individuals represented vast institutional wealth and possessed historically conservative voting patterns. They shifted uncomfortably in their expensive suits, avoiding any direct eye contact with me. I selected a chair at the extreme far end of the long table, projecting an aura of perfect tranquility. Valerie assumed the position directly to my right, operating officially as my designated advisory proxy. Her presence infuriated the surrounding executives because she clearly did not belong to their elite aristocratic circle. Valerie grew up analyzing logistics patterns for freight companies, developing an uncanny ability to spot systemic vulnerabilities. She brought an icy working-class pragmatism into a room entirely accustomed to pampered, aristocratic immunity. Preston slouched near the center of the arrangement, attempting to maintain a forced, nervous smile. His usual arrogant swagger had completely evaporated. The humiliating confrontation on the factory floor yesterday afternoon had clearly broken his spirit. He kept tapping his manicured fingernails against the polished wood, creating a rapid, irritating rhythm that echoed across the silent chamber. At precisely 8 o'clock, Richard strode into the room, taking his place at the head of the table. However, he lacked his usual booming, authoritative confidence. His complexion remained unusually pale, and dark, exhausted circles shadowed his eyes. The psychological warfare I initiated during the gala had clearly infected his mind. He shuffled a stack of printed legal documents, attempting to project control, but his hands exhibited a faint, undeniable tremor. He called the emergency session to order, clearing his throat several times before speaking. His stated agenda was singular and brutally direct. He proposed a binding resolution demanding my immediate formal expulsion from the corporation. Furthermore, he sought authorization for the aggressive, hostile seizure of my entire minority equity stake. He cited the catastrophic pressure test failure as undeniable proof of my gross professional negligence and willful sabotage. It was a fabricated narrative designed exclusively to eliminate the final obstacle blocking his illicit overseas liquidation scheme. The independent directors listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Richard rushed through the mandated procedural readings, speaking at an unnervingly accelerated pace. He was desperate to finalize my termination before any hidden variables could disrupt his carefully constructed timeline. He finished his opening statement and immediately called for an official vote, demanding a show of hands to seal my fate. Before a single arm could ascend into the air, the massive dual mahogany doors suddenly swung wide open. The heavy brass hinges groaned loudly, shattering the tense silence. Thomas Holden stepped across the threshold. The elderly attorney moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying his notoriously worn leather briefcase. Despite his advanced age, Holden commanded immense respect. Decades ago, he orchestrated the most aggressive corporate defense campaigns in the history of Midwestern manufacturing. He ruthlessly protected my grandfather's patents from predatory coastal conglomerates, earning a fearsome reputation within the legal community. He did not ask for permission to enter the restricted gathering. He simply claimed the space through sheer, undeniable presence. Mr. Chairman Holden stated, his gravelly voice halting every movement within the massive room. His tone resembled rough granite grinding against hardened steel. Richard jumped out of his expensive chair, his face turning a vibrant shade of panicked crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at the veteran lawyer, demanding his immediate removal by building security. He screamed that this private gathering was strictly restricted to active voting members and authorized corporate counsel. Holden ignored the frantic outburst entirely. He walked slowly down the length of the polished table, stopping directly across from the sweating chief executive. He opened his battered briefcase and retrieved the heavy, crimson 1982 incorporation ledger. He placed the antique volume onto the modern surface with a resounding thud. Before any binding votes are officially cast today, I am legally obligated to invoke the Founders Clause, Holden announced. The room descended into an absolute stunned silence. He rested his wrinkled hand atop the faded leather cover. This specific directive is irrevocably tied to the singular golden share currently residing within a highly secured blind trust. Richard slammed both of his fists onto the table, violently disrupting the pristine arrangement of his documents. He shouted that the ancient charter was completely dead. He aggressively claimed his expensive modern legal team had thoroughly nullified all previous historical bylaws during the restructuring phase 3 years ago. He insisted the archaic manuscript possessed absolutely no binding authority in a contemporary courtroom. Holden smiled a thin, humorless expression that sent a visible chill down Preston's spine. The veteran attorney slowly unclasped the book, revealing the yellowed parchment pages. "I assure you, Richard, this specific mechanism is entirely bulletproof," Holden replied, maintaining his terrifyingly calm demeanor. "Your expensive mercenary lawyers failed to discover this clause because it was deeply embedded within the original federal tax and corporation filings, not the standard operational bylaws. The founder anticipated your exact parasitic strategy. Holden turned his piercing gaze toward the bewildered independent directors. He explained that the blind trust containing the dictatorial equity was fully activated the moment a hostile internal entity attempted to liquidate domestic manufacturing assets. And until the explicit terms governing this trust are satisfactorily met, all pending executive actions are completely frozen, Holden declared. This absolute injunction specifically includes your pathetic attempt to orchestrate Breyer's termination. Nobody is voting on anything this morning. The blood drained rapidly from Richard's face. His grand overseas conspiracy was collapsing spectacularly right in front of his crucial institutional investors. He realized his hostile buyout timeline was now permanently stalled. But the final blow had yet to fall. The surprising truth regarding the trust's actual administrator remained concealed. Richard arrogantly assumed Holden controlled the dictatorial equity and prepared to attack the old man with accusations of a conflict of interest. "You cannot execute this grandfather clause," Richard spat, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "You are just a retired relic. You lack the active administrative standing to enforce a corporate freeze on my company. I am not the designated trustee," Richard, the elderly lawyer, clarified softly, taking a deliberate step backward. "I am merely the messenger, delivering the legal notification. The true administrator requires a secondary countersignature to complete the corporate takeover." Right on cue, the heavy doors opened a second time. Marcus Thorne, the chief executive of the Ford Automotive Empire, and the man Richard had desperately tried to impress at the gala last night, walked into our boardroom. The independent directors gasped audibly, recognizing the industry titan. Marcus was not merely an outside observer. He held the other half of the activation sequence. Marcus approached the table, producing a flawless digital copy of the offshore embezzlement routing numbers Valerie had secured. My grandfather named his greatest competitive rival as the ultimate guardian of this company, because he knew Marcus valued American industrial integrity above all else. "The freeze is effective immediately," Marcus announced, staring coldly at my father. But the failsafe also triggered an automatic federal audit due to the presence of unauthorized international wire transfers. The authorities are currently waiting in the lobby to discuss your secret foreign liquidation attempts. The sheer astonishment rippled through the seated board members. The aggressive termination meeting had instantly transformed into a spectacular criminal trap. Richard collapsed backward into his leather chair, utterly defeated and completely trapped within his own greedy machinations. The empire was finally secured, but a massive power vacuum now existed, requiring a ruthless new leader to rebuild the shattered foundation. The federal agents waiting diligently downstairs cast a long, ominous shadow over the sprawling mahogany table. Richard sat totally paralyzed within his luxurious chair as his grandiose ambitions dissolved into impending criminal indictments. The independent directors whispered furiously among themselves, attempting to process the sudden, catastrophic collapse of their leadership structure. The foreign buyers were long gone, having fled the premises when their illegal contracts were ruined by the timely ballroom sprinkler malfunction the previous night. Marcus Thorne stood near the exit, acting as a silent sentinel to ensure the absolute integrity of the corporate freeze. As polite but firm security personnel finally entered the room to escort my disgraced father toward the lobby for formal questioning, the sheer magnitude of the sudden power vacuum became violently apparent. A multi-billion-dollar manufacturing empire now lacked a functional, authoritative head. Corporate greed operates under principles identical to nature always rushing quickly to fill an empty void. Before the heavy double doors even clicked shut behind my father, Preston aggressively seized the momentary chaos. My cousin possessed an unearned, arrogant confidence nurtured by a lifetime of elite private schooling and unmerited executive promotions. He grew up residing in affluent suburban enclaves, positioned miles away from the industrial grime that actually funded his lavish lifestyle. He fundamentally believed leadership constituted a divine birthright bestowed through a prestigious family surname rather than a practical skill forged through grueling manual labor. He abruptly stood up, loudly slapping his soft palms against the polished wood, to assert his immediate claim. He vehemently argued that as the sole remaining senior vice president, standard executive continuity dictated he must instantly assume the acting chairmanship and consolidate all majority voting rights. The young executive waved a thick stack of proxy documents previously signed by his uncle, demanding the bewildered board immediately recognize his sudden ascension. The wealthy institutional investors looked incredibly hesitant, desperately seeking any semblance of operational stability amidst the unfolding federal scandal. Just as one of the highly conservative directors opened his mouth to second the hasty succession motion, Thomas Holden stepped directly back into the center of the hostile arena. The ancient attorney did not look remotely rattled by the chaotic morning events. He simply unclasped the heavy brass latch of the 1982 ledger once more. The sharp metallic sound echoed sharply across the cavernous room, resembling a judge striking a wooden gavel. Holden carefully turned the fragile yellowed parchment pages until he reached Section 42. He addressed the silent room, allowing his gravelly voice to project a profound historical weight. Grandfather Sinclair built this massive enterprise, utilizing his own two bare hands. The veteran lawyer began slowly scanning the terrified faces of the gathered executives. He always anticipated a dark, unpredictable day might arrive when the company could potentially be handed over to a polished corporate suit who possessed zero fundamental understanding of the actual physical work. To prevent such a catastrophic tragedy, the original founder instituted a mandatory physical competency test for any prospective executive attempting to assume absolute dictatorial voting rights during a fiercely contested succession period. The veteran attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses and traced a wrinkled finger along the faded antique ink. To properly activate the dictatorial golden share and officially assume the mantle of leadership, he read aloud, ensuring his diction remained incredibly crisp and unwavering. The heir apparent must, by their own hand and without any external assistance, manually fabricate a Sinclair 400X high-pressure valve directly on the active factory shop floor. The entire boardroom erupted instantly into a state of utter pandemonium. Several wealthy directors gasped audibly, while others began shouting over each other in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. They entirely comprehended the terrifying magnitude of that specific mechanical challenge. The 400X valve represented our absolute cornerstone component, serving as the beating mechanical heart of our most lucrative industrial contracts. It was an incredibly complex, notoriously difficult piece of heavy machinery to successfully craft from raw materials. Creating it required maintaining exact microscopic tolerances under extreme thermal stress. Just 1 millimeter of miscalculation during the delicate lathe cutting phase would ruin the entire project, resulting in a useless hunk of scrap metal. Constructing this masterpiece demanded a deeply ingrained, almost intuitive understanding of fluid metallurgy and advanced thermal dynamics. My grandfather famously spent 6 grueling years perfecting that single, specific design during the late 1970s. He practically lived on the factory floor during that innovative era, often sleeping on a narrow canvas cot positioned right beside the roaring industrial furnaces. He spent countless hours learning precisely how the molten steel breathed, expanded, and shifted under intense atmospheric pressure. The veteran men and women who currently operated our primary assembly lines considered anyone capable of successfully machining that specific, intricate part to be an undeniable master of their mechanical craft. It was the ultimate authentic test of raw industrial skill, remaining completely immune to the deceptive manipulations of wealthy corporate politicians. I am issuing that formal manufacturing challenge right now on behalf of Briar Sinclair Holden, declared his powerful voice, cutting swiftly through the frantic arguments of the panicked corporate directors. The elderly lawyer snapped the thick historical ledger shut, locking his piercing, intelligent gaze directly onto my trembling cousin. Preston's formerly smug, confident demeanor evaporated rapidly into thin air. The artificial, arrogant courage he managed to briefly muster just moments ago vanished entirely, leaving him totally exposed. His smooth complexion turned a sickly pale shade of green. He looked down nervously at his own impeccably manicured hands, hands which had never lifted anything heavier than a crystal liquor decanter or a premium imported fountain pen. He began to sweat profusely, his panicked breath catching painfully in his throat as the terrifying reality of the manufacturing mandate severely crushed his fragile, inflated ego. "This is completely ridiculous," Preston stammered loudly, his voice cracking violently in the middle of the suddenly quiet room. He pointed a shaking, erratic finger at the ancient leather book resting innocently on the mahogany table. "That constitutes an archaic, barbaric rule originating from a completely different primitive century. I hold a master's degree in business administration from a top-tier prestigious university. I thoroughly understand global supply chain logistics and advanced corporate financial modeling. I am a highly educated modern executive. I am certainly not some dirty, common machinist." I slowly stood up from my designated chair located at the far extreme end of the long conference table. I maintained perfect, rigid posture, purposely letting the heavy, absolute silence thoroughly amplify my physical presence within the room. I locked my unwavering eyes onto his terrified, sweating face. I deliberately chose not to raise my voice, but every single word I delivered was heavily laced with pure, uncompromising ice. "This is Detroit Preston," I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable with lethal surgical precision. "We do not build generational wealth utilizing fancy printed pieces of paper or theoretical mathematical financial models. We build our lasting legacy utilizing fire, sweat, and hardened steel. The hardworking men and women currently sweating down on those massive assembly floors do not care about your expensive elite university credentials. They only respect the undeniable physical truth of the actual work itself. If you truly desire to strip my title and command this sprawling empire, you must physically earn it." The old-school industrial investors sitting around the massive table exchanged long, incredibly meaningful glances with one another. Despite their current immense personal wealth and their expensive tailored suits, these specific veteran directors originally acquired their vast fortunes by funding the gritty blue-collar manufacturing boom across the Midwest decades ago. They possessed a latent, deeply buried, intrinsic respect for the unyielding, authentic logic governing the shop floor. They fundamentally understood that an arrogant executive who could not physically comprehend the core mechanical product remained inherently dangerous to their massive financial portfolios. Slowly and deliberately, one by one, the senior board members nodded their heads in unanimous, silent agreement. The mandatory physical challenge was officially sanctioned without any further debate. The cavernous room slowly emptied as the exhausted directors departed to coordinate a necessary strict oversight for the upcoming unprecedented mechanical duel. Preston remained totally frozen within his leather chair, staring blankly at the polished wooden surface in pure shock. As Valerie and I confidently turned to exit the silent chamber, my encrypted mobile device vibrated quietly inside my jacket pocket. It was an urgent text message from Big Joe, sent directly from the heavily guarded lower production levels. The brief, alarming message contained a chilling new revelation that instantly shifted the dangerous parameters of the impending battle. Preston had actually anticipated this exact corporate scenario months ago when his hired mercenaries first discovered the hidden clause. He had secretly ordered his private security contractors to maliciously recalibrate the primary industrial lathes, intentionally sabotaging the specific machines we were required to utilize. If I attempted to cut the high-pressure valve utilizing the compromised equipment tomorrow morning, the imminent structural failure would not merely result in a failed mechanical test. The resulting violent shrapnel explosion would be completely lethal. The executive elevator carried our tense procession downward into the belly of the massive industrial complex. The transition from the pristine corporate suites above to the raw manufacturing level below felt like descending into an entirely different dimension. The deafening roar that usually defined the facility had been completely silenced by my emergency injunction. A profound, heavy stillness hung in the air, saturated heavily with the sharp, metallic scent of cutting oil and heated iron. The entire board of directors relocated, leaving their comfortable leather chairs to stand awkwardly amidst the sprawling expanse of concrete. They huddled close together, looking severely out of place, wearing their expensive tailored suits, surrounded by towering hydraulic presses and suspended overhead cranes. Big Joe and the veteran legacy workers formed a formidable human perimeter around the designated testing area. They stood shoulder to shoulder with their muscular arms crossed defensively, waiting patiently to watch the corporate golden boy attempt to prove his actual worth. Standing near the front of the observing crowd was my sister-in-law, Chloe. She is a brilliant African-American woman who serves as a senior compliance investigator for the Federal Trade Commission. She married my older sibling years ago, before he wisely abandoned the toxic family business altogether. Chloe possessed an incredibly sharp analytical gaze, and she offered me a brief, silent nod of solidarity. She intimately understood the pervasive corruption rotting within my familial bloodline, having successfully investigated similar corporate sociopaths throughout her distinguished legal career. Preston stood nervously before the massive manual turning apparatus. The heavy iron equipment loomed over him, casting a dark, intimidating shadow across his pale, sweating face. He wore a borrowed pair of plastic safety glasses that kept sliding down the bridge of his nose. His hands were trembling so visibly that he could barely hold the thick, protective leather gloves provided by the floor foreman. My relative stared blankly at the solid, cylindrical, raw billet of aerospace-grade steel resting on the nearby wooden workbench. He looked at the dense metal block as if it were a volatile, unexploded munition waiting to detonate. He possessed absolutely no muscle memory for this grueling physical labor, having spent his entire privileged life manipulating financial spreadsheets instead of shaping raw materials. The instructions were brutally simple, but mechanically unforgiving. He needed to lock the heavy steel cylinder perfectly centered within the rotating jaw mechanism and shave the outer surface down to an exact microscopic tolerance. He tentatively engaged the primary power switch, sending a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the thick concrete foundation. However, his fingers shook violently, causing him to fail completely at securing the heavy chuck properly. He tightened the locking bolts unevenly, leaving the massive block of raw iron fundamentally unbalanced. As the powerful spindle whirred to life, accelerating to a blinding operational speed, the improperly secured material began to wobble erratically. The entire massive housing shook violently under the immense, unbalanced centrifugal force, generating a terrifying low-frequency rumble. Total panic quickly consumed him. Instead of immediately hitting the large red emergency stop button, Preston made a fatal amateur mistake. He desperately cranked the manual wheel forward, jamming the hardened cutting tool directly into the spinning metal at a completely incorrect, brutal angle. A horrific, ear-piercing screech instantly filled the vast, silent arena as the immovable blade violently impacted the unbalanced, rotating mass. The immense kinetic friction generated a shower of blinding yellow sparks that illuminated the dark space. The thick carbide tool snapped cleanly in half, echoing loudly like a sudden gunshot. The extreme rotational velocity ripped the loose steel billet completely out of the gripping jaws. The heavy metallic projectile flew wildly across the open space, violently striking the thick polycarbonate safety shield with a terrifying, deafening crash. The reinforced protective barrier spiderwebbed, instantly, absorbing the lethal kinetic impact, but fulfilling its intended purpose beautifully. Preston stumbled frantically backward, tripping over his own expensive shoes and falling hard onto the oil-stained floor. He lay there gasping for air, having narrowly escaped a severe, permanent injury. The silence returning to the sprawling plant was absolute and entirely devoid of any sympathy. The seasoned workers merely shook their heads, displaying pure, unadulterated disgust at his dangerous incompetence. The wealthy investors exchanged horrified glances, realizing precisely how close they just came to witnessing a gruesome, fatal accident. Their lingering faith in his leadership abilities evaporated instantly, leaving him totally discredited in front of the entire assembly. Thomas Holden stepped forward, analyzing the smoking, ruined equipment with a cold, clinical detachment. He failed the elderly attorney, noted his gravelly voice echoing loudly against the high vaulted ceilings. The primary corporate challenger has fundamentally proven his absolute inability to command this specific enterprise. Holden turned his piercing gaze toward me, indicating that my mandatory trial was now officially commencing. I stepped forward slowly, feeling the heavy collective stare of every single person residing within the cavernous building, tracking my every movement. I reached up and pulled my loose hair back, twisting the strands into a tight, secure bun. I fastened the heavy leather apron around my waist, feeling a profound sense of righteous purpose washing over my focused mind. However, the secret warning message from Big Joe burned vividly within my memory, altering the stakes of this crucial demonstration. Preston had maliciously ordered his private security contractors to covertly sabotage the equipment earlier this morning, before the board even convened. Walking purposefully toward the secondary machine assigned for my specific trial, I carefully scanned the complex mechanical layout. My trained eyes quickly noticed a tiny, nearly invisible hairline fracture purposefully etched into the primary hydraulic pressure line. That specific hose controlled the flow of pressurized chemical coolant required to prevent the friction heat from melting the shaping blade. The insidious trap was brilliantly engineered to look exactly like a tragic accidental malfunction. If I activated the main cooling pump during the intense cutting phase, the immense internal pressure would explosively rupture the weakened seal. The compromised hose would spray blinding, scalding fluid directly into my unprotected face, permanently disfiguring me and ending my career forever. I stood positioned before the rigged apparatus, trapped inside an impossible, deadly paradox. Refusing to operate the machinery meant an automatic, immediate forfeiture of my ancestral corporate inheritance, handing the empire directly back to my corrupted bloodline. But engaging the corrupted spindle guaranteed my absolute physical destruction. The wealthy board members watched impatiently, completely oblivious to the lethal trap silently waiting to execute me right in front of them. I slowly ran my gloved fingertips along the cold iron surface, calculating the exact fluid dynamics required to bypass the severed line. I realized the only way to successfully fabricate the necessary high-pressure component without triggering the explosive chemical spray involved executing a highly dangerous, forgotten technique. My grandfather used to perform an ancient method known as dry running, where the machinist relies entirely on auditory feedback and rhythmic manual pulsing to manage the extreme thermal load without utilizing any synthetic liquid coolant. It was an incredibly reckless strategy that demanded absolute perfection because a single microscopic error would instantly fuse the blade to the steel and shatter the entire machine block. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the manual control wheel while firmly deciding to risk everything on my inherited instinct. I stood before the compromised, heavy industrial lathe, fully aware that a single microscopic miscalculation would trigger a lethal explosion of pressurized chemical coolant. The wealthy institutional investors watched my silent preparation with intense scrutiny, completely oblivious to the deadly mechanical sabotage orchestrated by my terrified cousin. I reached deep into the tailored pocket of my structured black suit and retrieved my late grandfather's tarnished brass calipers. The cold, heavy metal felt incredibly grounding against my bare skin. This simple analog tool survived decades of grueling factory work, serving as a physical testament to authentic Midwestern craftsmanship. I deliberately reached up and disconnected the primary digital interface monitor, completely blinding the modern computerized targeting systems. The young corporate executives in the crowd gasped audibly at my sudden, reckless action. I was choosing to completely ignore the sophisticated digital displays, opting instead to recalibrate the massive cutting machine, utilizing only raw touch and intuitive auditory feedback. The ancient technique of dry running required an absolute harmonic synchronization between the human operator and the raw, dense material. I secured a fresh solid billet of aerospace-grade steel into the heavy rotating jaws, ensuring the complex locking mechanism was flawlessly balanced. I engaged the primary electrical spindle, relying entirely on my inherited instinct and deep metallurgical education. The massive iron apparatus roared to life, vibrating with an immense, terrifying power that rattled the concrete floor. Instead of activating the rigged hydraulic cooling pump, I gripped the manual control wheel with both of my hands. I slowly advanced the hardened carbide blade toward the rapidly spinning metal block. The initial physical contact produced a sharp, resonant shriek that echoed violently throughout the cavernous manufacturing facility. I closed my eyes for a brief, solitary moment, focusing my entire consciousness strictly on the distinct frequency emitting from the grinding steel. The piercing sound shifted subtly from a harsh metallic scream to a deep rhythmic hum, indicating the optimal cutting velocity had been successfully achieved. I adjusted the manual feed rate, utilizing practiced fluid motions that entirely bypassed the critical need for artificial liquid lubrication. Long, brilliant silver ribbons of shaved steel began to spiral gracefully away from the central friction point. The ambient temperature surrounding the machine spiked dramatically, radiating a wave of intense physical heat that soaked entirely through my formal clothing. I maintained the punishing, exhausting rhythm, manually pulsing the physical pressure to prevent the fragile blade from permanently fusing to the superheated workpiece. The seasoned legacy workers standing faithfully in the protective perimeter recognized the legendary forgotten technique immediately. Big Joe nodded his head in profound, silent respect, while the wealthy board members merely stared in absolute, bewildered silence. For nearly 40 grueling minutes, I existed purely in a state of intense, singular focus. The deafening roar of the lathe completely drowned out the chaotic political warfare corrupting my family dynasty. I relied solely on the tarnished brass calipers to meticulously measure the incredibly precise microscopic tolerances required for the complex geometric design. The heavy, thick scent of burning iron saturated my lungs, constantly reminding me of the authentic, industrial foundation that originally built our massive corporate empire. I confidently executed the final delicate threading sequence, allowing the heavy machine to slowly spin down into a complete, vibrating halt. I released the tight locking clamps and retrieved the finished component using thick, insulated leather pads to protect my hands from the blistering heat. I turned away from the cooling equipment and tossed the still smoking metal directly onto the central steel inspection table. The heavy component landed with a resounding, authoritative thud that startled the nervous executives. The designated independent quality assurance foreman stepped forward, utilizing precise laser measuring instruments to thoroughly evaluate my grueling physical labor. He meticulously scanned the internal threading and the external containment casing, actively checking for any infinitesimal structural deviations. He finally looked up, locking his wide eyes with Thomas Holden, and simply nodded his head. The manually fabricated 400X high-pressure valve was mathematically perfect. A slow, solitary clap began echoing from the far distant corner of the silent factory floor. Marcus Thorne, the powerful chief executive of the rival automotive empire, proudly initiated the applause. The highly conservative independent directors quickly joined the rhythmic sound, collectively acknowledging the true, rightful heir to the sprawling dynasty. The deafening applause eventually washed over the immense concrete room, validating my grueling physical victory. However, I felt absolutely no internal desire to celebrate this specific triumphant moment. The intricate mechanical challenge merely secured my legitimate administrative corporate authority. The final necessary act of total corporate purification still remained woefully incomplete. I turned my back on the cheering investors and gestured toward Valerie, who stood quietly near the outer perimeter. She stepped forward, holding a thick, sealed manila envelope containing the devastating digital forensics we meticulously gathered over the past several months. I accepted the heavy document package and walked deliberately toward my disgraced father. Richard stood closely near his terrified nephew, looking completely exhausted and entirely defeated. I dropped the massive pile of printed evidence directly onto the steel inspection table, right next to my flawlessly machined mechanical masterpiece. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer, icy conviction in my tone forced the entire room to fall instantly silent. "He did not merely fail a simple competency test, Dad," I stated clearly, gesturing toward my trembling, pathetic cousin. "He systematically stole from us, and you desperately tried to sell out this entire city just to cover up his massive financial crimes." Richard reached forward with violently shaking hands, pulling the top glossy documents from the organized stack. He frantically reviewed the detailed transaction ledgers, aggressively exposing Preston's illicit offshore shell companies and the catastrophic unauthorized asset liquidations. The complex empire of toxic illusions he spent countless years carefully constructing was rapidly collapsing right before his very eyes. The indisputable proof of massive internal corporate embezzlement sat perfectly aligned with the secret foreign buyout contracts he arrogantly attempted to authorize during the gala last night. As the legally reinstated senior vice president and the newly confirmed absolute holder of the dictatorial golden share, I am officially initiating a complete administrative purge, I announced boldly, projecting my voice to reach every single person gathered within the sprawling facility. "Preston, you are officially terminated from this organization, effective immediately. Furthermore, your fraudulent financial activities have already been directly referred to the proper federal law enforcement authorities." Right on cue, my brilliant African-American sister-in-law, Chloe, stepped forward confidently from the dense crowd of assembled factory workers. Representing the Federal Trade Commission, she produced a formalized legal arrest warrant detailing the extensive wire fraud and international conspiracy charges. Preston collapsed entirely, falling heavily onto the oil-stained concrete floor while weeping uncontrollably as the federal agents finally approached to place him in heavy steel handcuffs. I turned my intense, unyielding focus back to my father, who was currently staring blankly at the ruined remnants of his shattered professional legacy. "I demand your immediate formal resignation from the board of directors," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of any lingering familial sympathy. "You will systematically surrender all remaining executive privileges before you exit this building today." Richard looked up at me, his tired eyes welling with bitter, unspoken regret. He finally recognized the undeniable tragic truth that the capable daughter he constantly marginalized had ultimately become the absolute, uncompromising architect of his necessary destruction. Without uttering a single word in his own pathetic defense, he slowly turned around and walked toward the primary exit, silently escorted by the remaining security personnel. The chaotic, disruptive noise eventually faded away, leaving only the comforting low hum of the massive industrial generators steadily vibrating beneath my feet. I stood firmly planted on the cold, solid concrete of the active shop floor, completely surrounded by the veteran machinists who truly constituted the beating, authentic heart of our enterprise. I gently gripped the cooling steel of the high-pressure valve, feeling the immense, historical weight of my hard-earned victory. The intense, grueling battle for the soul of Sinclair Heavy Industries was finally, definitively over. I remained standing there proudly as the true, undisputed master of my grandfather's grand legacy, realizing with absolute peaceful clarity that I was finally exactly where I belonged. Standing on that cold, concrete floor, the low hum of the massive generators vibrating steadily through the soles of my shoes, I realized the intense battle for our ancestral empire was never truly about corporate supremacy. It was a profound testament to the devastating consequences of catastrophic parenting and moral decay. When my father walked out of that sprawling manufacturing facility in absolute defeat, escorted away by silent security personnel, he was not merely losing control of a multi-billion-dollar industrial conglomerate. He was reaping the inevitable harvest of decades spent cultivating deception, displaying a total lack of emotional awareness, and abandoning his fundamental responsibilities as a patriarch. Looking back at the smoking steel resting on the table and the disgraced cousin weeping pathetically on the floor, the clarity of the entire situation washed over my exhausted mind. The spectacular destruction of our family was not caused by external market forces or predatory foreign investors seeking a quick profit. It was meticulously orchestrated from within, dismantled slowly, piece by piece, by a father who fundamentally misunderstood the core of long-term guidance and authentic American family values. In traditional American culture, we often heavily romanticize the conceptual nature of legacy. We mistakenly believe that handing down a pristine finished product, whether it is a thriving international business or an untouched trust fund, is the ultimate expression of deep parental love. We dangerously equate financial security with emotional stability, entirely missing the crucial underlying fact that true individual character is never simply inherited. It must be brutally forged through personal adversity. My father looked at Preston and saw a remarkably easy mirror, a compliant sycophant who would never dare challenge his authority or demand strict honesty. He pampered his nephew incessantly, deliberately shielded him from the exhausting realities of actual physical labor, and artificially inflated his fragile ego without ever requiring him to earn his elevated status. This is unequivocally the gravest injustice any parent can inflict upon a developing child. By aggressively removing the necessary friction of genuine struggle, my father effectively stripped my cousin of his basic human dignity. He raised a hollow shell of a man, someone completely incapable of surviving the scorching heat of reality when the artificial protective walls inevitably collapsed. True long-term guidance requires allowing our children to fail miserably, to bleed from their own mistakes, and to feel the heavy consequence of their profound incompetence. Fostering a healthy, traditional family structure demands an uncompromising daily commitment to absolute fairness and profound emotional intelligence. My father severely lacked both of these essential traits. He directly observed my relentless daily dedication, my deep understanding of the raw manufacturing materials, and my unyielding competence. Yet he willfully chose to consistently marginalize my efforts. He was deeply terrified of my fierce independence because it constantly highlighted his own lingering moral cowardice and intellectual shortcuts. A truly responsible parent must possess the immense emotional fortitude to recognize and actively nurture the unique strengths of their offspring, even when those specific strengths intimidate their own insecurities. Raising highly capable, resilient adult citizens requires a solid psychological foundation built entirely on unvarnished honesty. When parents openly play favorites, when they actively reward manipulative behavior over actual merit, they deliberately plant a highly toxic seed of dark resentment that will eventually grow to strangle the entire family tree. My father foolishly believed his biological authority automatically granted him permanent immunity from any real accountability. He entirely forgot that genuine respect within any household is always a reciprocal currency. You cannot logically demand blind loyalty from a hardworking daughter while simultaneously attempting to illegally liquidate her rightful birthright to cover up the criminal failures of a preferred relative. The mandatory physical competency test, designed by my late visionary grandfather, was not merely a quirky historical anomaly. It was a brilliant, enduring lesson in ultimate parental responsibility. My grandfather thoroughly understood that the authentic, foundational American dream is never maintained through polished academic degrees or manipulative boardroom politics. It is strictly sustained by an intimate, brutally honest connection to the raw, physical work itself. He knew intuitively that the absolute greatest gift he could possibly leave his descendants was not an overflowing bank account, but rather an immovable standard of personal excellence. He specifically instituted that terrifying mandatory lathe trial because he actually loved his family enough to actively prevent them from completely destroying themselves through the poison of unearned entitlement. That ancient tarnished brass caliper I utilized to perfectly measure the high-pressure valve represented the undeniable truth of the physical universe. Heavy industrial machinery does not care about your influential last name, your biological gender, or your severely bruised ego. It only responds to genuine skill, infinite patience, and profound, dedicated respect for the craft. These are the exact, identical principles required to successfully raise a highly functional, decent human being. We must constantly measure our growing children against the uncompromising, rigid standards of basic human decency and genuine capability, absolutely refusing to artificially lower the bar simply to spare their temporary, fleeting feelings. Reflecting deeply upon the dramatic public collapse of my own powerful family dynasty, I am constantly struck by the immense weight of generational trauma and historical expectations. We are very often taught by society that it is our solemn, unbreakable duty to unconditionally preserve the original family unit, completely, regardless of the dark internal rot quietly consuming the structural foundation. But carrying that toxic burden blindly is a profound, damaging disservice to our own mental health and to the innocent future generations we are fiercely meant to protect. If you deeply resonate with these intense, recurring themes of familial betrayal, personal resilience, and the painful but necessary process of violently reclaiming your own stolen narrative, I highly encourage you to consistently follow Aura Vengeance. We constantly explore these dark, complex human dynamics, shedding necessary light on the hidden, quiet battles fought daily within the deepest, private corridors of our own, supposedly safe homes. Engaging regularly with these dramatic stories actively helps us articulate the silent struggles we endure, providing a clear, honest mirror to evaluate our own, highly complicated domestic realities. Ultimately, the widely accepted traditional view of eternal parental devotion is fundamentally flawed. Modern society constantly insists that biological blood is infinitely thicker than water, heavily suggesting a divine mandate for eternal, unquestioning forgiveness and unwavering, silent submission to our historical elders. We are strictly instructed to perpetually honor our parents simply because they physically brought us into this unforgiving world. But I have slowly learned a much darker, far more liberating philosophical truth through the searing fires of my own recent crucible. A basic biological connection is merely a random accident of geography and raw genetics. It guarantees absolutely nothing regarding character or morality. The absolute most dangerous, pervasive myth in modern parenting is the universally celebrated concept of unconditional love. Love, true, fiercely protective, character-building love, must be inherently and unapologetically conditional. It must be explicitly conditioned upon mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and the consistent daily demonstration of basic moral integrity. When a parent intentionally betrays those fundamental sacred conditions, they automatically and permanently forfeit their parental authority. Sometimes the most profound, deeply loving act of genuine family loyalty is entirely destroying the corrupted family unit itself. Only by burning the diseased, rotting structure completely to the bare ground can you successfully preserve the pure, untainted earth beneath it, leaving a clean, starkly empty space where something genuinely healthy might finally have the necessary courage to grow.